Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. With Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons wrapped up, we're now returning to the 2D side of the Zelda series with a trip to Koholint Island, the setting of Link's Awakening. But before we get into the actual first dungeon, there's a few things I'd like to discuss. First of all, for this series, I'll be playing both the Switch remake of Link's Awakening as well as the GBA enhanced Link's Awakening DX via NSO. This game has had numerous releases, but if you were to visit the game for the first time today, these are the two versions I would recommend jumping into for the best experiences. Plus, just as we had done with Majora's Mask back in the day, I wanted to make some notes and compare version differences. While the Switch remake is mostly faithful to the original in terms of tile set placements and map designs, the art style is completely overhauled, leading to a distinctly different tone. Couple that with the numerous quality of life improvements, and each version has some pros and cons to weigh out. I think that DX has a darker tone, which jives with me, but the music of the remake is downright gorgeous. And I won't lie, the biggest advantage that the remake has is its controls. See, Link's Awakening was a Game Boy game, so it had all of 2 face buttons to work with, but paired with all of the ambition of what the Zelda team found themselves capable of making with games like A Link to the Past. So there's some major compromises made in terms of item management and controls. The Switch, simply by virtue of having more buttons and using them all, corrects this issue, which is frankly my biggest complaint with the Game Boy versions of the game. So there's some trade-offs, but either version is worthwhile if you've never had the chance to play Link's Awakening before. It is a very special game. Alright, with all of that said, we should get into talking about the actual game itself. So let's talk about the beginning of Link's Awakening. Shipwrecked in a storm, Link is found on the beach by Marin. After our hero awakens and gets his shield, we can take the south path down to the beach where she found us. At the shore, we'll find our sword. And it's then that a mysterious owl will tell us that in order to leave the island, we must awaken the windfish and to head north into the forest. At this point, of course, we don't actually know what a windfish is, but we'll find out. With our sword in hand, we can cut these plants blocking our way and head north. Classic Zelda item gating. Good stuff. In the mysterious forest, we'll get trolled by this raccoon, so avoid him. Instead, we'll find a mushroom, which we can take to the witch's hut and exchange for magic powder. We can then use this magic powder on said raccoon. Turns out it was Terran, Marin's father, who was magically transformed after eating some toadstools. Don't eat funny mushrooms you find in the woods, kids. With that done, we'll find the Tail Key, which opens the entrance to Tail Cave, the first dungeon. Good stuff. Before we head inside, a few notes to discuss about the game's brief opening sequence. First of all, this was, of course, just a summary of the mandatory stuff, but in reality, there's an entire village to explore here if you feel so inclined, including a shop, several houses, and a couple of fun minigames. It's great that the game lets you have so much space right at the start, but not too much that you can't get the lay of the land. The amount of stuff is even further expanded in the Switch remake. If you know where to look, you're able to assemble an entire heart container and go into the first dungeon with 4 hearts instead of 3. There's a lengthy trading sequence that can be started here as well, which you'll probably be drawn to right away since the first item is a Yoshi doll. I mean, Who wouldn't want a Yoshi doll? Overall though, this intro sequence does a great job of easing you into the game's core ideas. A straightforward linear path that teaches you how to block and avoid enemies, a return trip with your sword allowing you to defeat those enemies, a subtle lesson on items being able to open new paths that you may have already passed by, rewards such as heart pieces for exploring thoroughly, and a somewhat labyrinthian area in the woods, which requires you to find key items with some slightly harder enemies thrown in the mix. All classic Zelda stuff, taught to us gracefully in only a few minutes. There aren't a lot of version differences to go over here, aside from the remake having a seamless scrolling viewpoint instead of screen transitions like the original, and that tone feels a bit different. I do appreciate the more detailed world map of the remake as well, and the ability to leave map markers. The original's map, by necessity, is rather abstract in comparison. It does the job well enough, but it lacks a lot of the details that the remake has, and if you're not as good at drawing a mental map of the area, then places like these woods are going to feel a bit more winding and confusing. Something introduced to us here as well is the game's overall progression structure, in which simply finding the dungeon entrance is not good enough. There will be objectives to complete in the overworld in order to get the dungeon-specific key and unlock access to those dungeons. A Link to the Past sometimes played around with this idea, but more often than not, if you could reach a dungeon, then you could do it. Here, the dungeon order is pretty rigid, and you absolutely have to progress the story between dungeons. But that's a good thing. There's a lot of little character moments we get to see that the first 3 Zelda games didn't have. Otherwise, there's not much else to discuss here, but I do appreciate how well this intro teaches us this stuff without being super intrusive about it. It's a very concise introduction overall. Alright, with all of that done, we can use the tail key to open this gate and head into the dungeon. Welcome to Tail Cave, a competent first dungeon. Why is it called Tail Cave? I'm not totally sure, but after a glance at the dungeon map, my suspicion is that the dungeon is modeled after its boss, Moldorm, who himself is about 70% tail. The dungeon also has mini Moldorms, who in Japanese are simply called tails, so that's probably the reason. Tail Cave is a cave with tails in it, and it looks like a tail. A neat bit of foreshadowing is that the tail key and the statues outside of the dungeon are depictions of Moldorm as well. This game plays around with the idea of shaping its dungeon layouts after specific items or creatures, which is a neat concept, but at times can hold back the level design. More often than not though, it isn't an issue, and Tail Cave is among those exceptions. While not particularly difficult for a seasoned Zelda player, let's remember that it's the beginning of the game still. However, the vibe here is spot on. We've got a cavernous aesthetic with lots of pitfalls, traps, and enemies who are more numerous and aggressive compared to those that we encountered outside. It isn't a hard dungeon, but it feels dangerous and tense, though I would have liked for its architecture, or lack thereof, to feel a bit more visually distinct. Oddly enough, this is less of an issue in the original, but in the remake, the wall textures are identical to that of normal caves, aside from the coloration. The original instead gave us wafer cookie walls, which aren't super interesting to look at, but they're distinct enough. And honestly, does anybody other than me spend a lot of time looking at dungeon wall textures? Probably not, right? I do find the choices of color palette to be pretty interesting though. In either case, the walls have a red hue to them, but the DX version opts for gray and blue accents on blocks and doors, as well as the flagstone floor itself. Meanwhile, the Switch remake leans more into that stony cave aesthetic with brown, solid stone floors instead of the flagstone from from the original. This means that cracked floors stand out more in the remake, and actually look a little out of place, almost like they're reimagined as specifically designated traps rather than unstable parts of the floor. All this is not to knock on the remake. I just find the different interpretations to be interesting. In fact, I'd argue that while it works on the Game Boy Color, the blue floor would look pretty out of place in the remake's art style. Plus, the Switch remake's added details to a lot of these textures is really nice. They add a lot of flourish to highlight areas of importance while still adhering to the original intentions behind those designs and the dungeon's dangerous vibe. That feeling is aided by the music. Something I want to note here actually is that Link's Awakening was the first Zelda game that gave us dungeon-specific music. Zelda 1 and 2 and A Link to the Past had a total of 2 dungeon themes each. The NES titles both had their dungeon themes shared among all of their respective dungeons with the exception of the final dungeon, while A Link to the Past made the distinction with its music between light and dark world dungeons. It is interesting then that Link's Awakening, a game made for technically inferior hardware, made the choice to give every dungeon unique music, a choice that is very welcome. The original version of the song is pretty good, honestly, given what the Game Boy was capable of. It shifts between curious and tense really nicely, which is perfect for a Zelda dungeon, which tend to blend combat and puzzles. The remake does a wonderful job translating the chiptunes to actual instruments. It nails the intended feeling of the track nearly perfectly. The only part I'd say the original does better is the feeling of unease in this particular section. Which by comparison feels a bit downplayed in the Switch version. But regardless, it still is a great piece of dungeon music, even if it feels thematically pretty similar to the usual cave theme. As for the dungeon progression, I feel it strikes a pretty great balance of exploration, combat, and puzzles. Immediately in the first room, we've got a fork in the road, requiring us to explore both paths. If you get too far exploring straight forward without going left first, then you're going to find yourself short a key, and without the compass. That said, finding the compass before the map always feels weird and illegal to me, but I do like the added feature of the compass sounding off a little jingle when you're in a room with a treasure chest that you haven't found yet. Plus, this was the first Zelda game where the compass marked the locations of treasure chests on the map, a series staple going forward. Prior games only had it reveal the boss location. This certainly makes the compass more useful, and given that there's no minimap, the audio indicator goes a long way to making sure that you don't miss things. Taking the northern route offers a second split in the road, but either direction will take us to the dungeon's large central room. The right path has the dungeon map as well as a one-way door that drops us into said central room, while the left path has a room with keys, but access isn't one directional, so you can use this route to backtrack if you missed stuff. In the central room, we have a few more options as to where to go next. The path northwest is where we'll find the dungeon item, the excellent Rock's Feather, which is so useful that it's gonna be permanently mapped to my X button during the rest of this playthrough. The path northeast loops us up to this ledge to get the boss key, and the path straight east will eventually lead us towards the boss fight itself, barring a small detour. There is also a small hidden room to the west that is entirely inaccessible due to us not having bombs yet, and yes, it does bother me. Something to highlight is the use cases for the dungeon item, the Roc's Feather. This is essentially a jump ability, which Link traditionally isn't able to do, but the dungeon, small as it is, gives us plenty of opportunity to use it. First, immediately after getting it, there are some recovery hearts floating in the air that we can hop up to grab. We also can hop over the gaps in the underground passage that we crossed through to get back the way we came, hop over this little gap to take a shortcut back through this room, and one more hop right here to avoid this blade trap safely. Yes, this little backtrack with shortcuts took you right through a dungeon item tutorial without you even realizing it. Additionally, those aforementioned routes from the central room to the east and northeast are only accessible after getting this item, reinforcing that ability gating concept I mentioned before the dungeon. We can go here earlier than this and see that there is a path to take, we just can't actually reach those areas until we have the item we need. So both the boss key and route towards the boss are dependent on us having the dungeon item first. That's good too, because this east path also takes us into the mid-boss fight against the Spike Roller, which the dungeon item is essential for, since it allows you to jump over his rolling spike trap and then attack him. He is not a hard mid-boss by any means. You can wail on him and take him down pretty quickly. But again, this is the first dungeon. I like that fighting him puts the item to use and makes jumping to avoid damage feel like a natural extension of Link's abilities. Also, a trend that starts in Link's Awakening and gets carried over to a lot of handheld titles is that defeating the mid-boss opens a portal that will warp you back to the start of the dungeon and back, serving as a handy shortcut if need be. This was probably done due to the fact that the game was originally designed with being a portable title in mind, so something like this could save you some valuable time if you're playing in short bursts and have to stop before you can finish the dungeon. Finally, there's one more optional detour to get some recovery hearts if need be, but otherwise at this point, we can confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll immediately be confronted by Moldorm, making a return from A Link to the Past. In the DX version, he shares Link's color palette, so he's got this sleek green and black color scheme. The Switch remake updates him to more closely resemble the hungry burger worm monster from A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. I'm fine with either design, though he does lose his mandibles in the adaptation, but I like the consistency since Link's Awakening is a sequel to A Link to the Past. Either way, Moldorm is a total pushover of a boss in this game. It doesn't even really feel like he's attacking you. He's more just zooming around the room, doing his own goofy little thing, so you can very easily avoid him and strike at his tail to take him down. I don't mind the lack of difficulty here. I'll keep tapping the sign, it's only the first dungeon, so Moldorm gets a pass from me. It is ultimately a retread of the battle from A Link to the Past, but despite the arena being so much smaller here compared to when we fought him at the Tower of Hera, the added mobility of having the Roc's Feather coupled with Moldorm's low health value makes this fight a whole lot easier than that one, especially in the Switch remake. In the original version, the chasm around the arena takes up these entire sections of the room, bracketing the arena. The remake adds in some cracked floor tiles. These will still break if stood upon for too long, but they offer a lot more grace and wiggle room to recover during the fight. Worth a mention here, I criticized Moldorm in A Link to the Past for not having any dungeon item integration. While that is true for this version of Moldorm as well, technically, I'm not inclined to dock it any points for that either, since the feather does improve our mobility, making the fight much easier. And the mid-boss was already clearly designed around using that item as well, so it still gets its chance to shine in a combat scenario. Overall though, Moldorm is a perfectly serviceable boss fight. It isn't bad per se, I just find it largely uninteresting. Either way, Moldorm should go down pretty quickly. I gotta appreciate the way he explodes in segments like this. It's a bit over the top, but very on brand for Zelda bosses. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual. We'll find the full moon cello, the first dungeon MacGuffin. The first of 8 instruments of the sirens needed to awaken the windfish. And we're off. Overall, Tail Cave works really well as a starter dungeon. I appreciate the multiple branching paths and different routes the dungeon allows for. While great in either version, one thing I think the remake does a little better is its seamless scrolling in larger rooms. The classic screen transitions are retained in dungeons when going through doors which cleanly divide rooms, but for those larger rooms, such as the central room, having the screen scroll smoothly like this helps it not feel so disjointed. I am aware that this is a technical limitation of the Game Boy, but that doesn't mean I can't still appreciate the change in the remake. It makes this room feel more like one larger room while still being faithful to the dungeon's floor plan. It's a small but welcome update. I also like how it employs the old treasure chest tease, allowing you to see things you can't quite reach yet. That is until you have the required item. The dungeon is not perfect, however. The inclusion of a bombable wall here annoys me. We cannot get bombs yet, which means we'll have to revisit this dungeon later on in order to get a single treasure chest. It's optional, yes, but I'm a completionist even to my own detriment at times. I also am not fond of the placement of the stone beak. For context, each dungeon will have a series of owl statues that are missing the beak. We can find said beak hidden somewhere in each dungeon, which allows us to interact with the statues for some clues. That's usually fine, but in Tail Cave, the beak is placed on the eastern side of the dungeon, right before the mid-boss and subsequent dungeon boss, meaning that if you want to see those other owl statue interactions, you'll have to backtrack across a great deal of the dungeon. And honestly, the hints aren't usually that worthwhile, at least not the ones in this dungeon. I do, however, really like the aesthetic of this room and the matching puzzle with this 3-of-a-kind enemy. The beak's placement is probably here for people who explored and got a little too off track, since this room, as deep into the dungeon as it is accessible pretty early on. So with that in mind, it's fairly excusable. Above all else though, this dungeon does a fantastic job of teaching and reinforcing a lot of concepts that are going to be critical to this game, such as having to explore multiple branching paths, the existence of underground passages to connect distant rooms within a dungeon, a returning concept from Zelda 1, and using your dungeon item to gain access to new areas. It shows with its multiple routes that sometimes there are different ways of reaching the same area, and how doors can be unlocked under different conditions, such as by finding keys, needing to defeat enemies, or solving puzzles. It also does the same for treasure chests and keys, showing different ways of gaining access to them, as well as the different sorts of things found within those chests, whether it be the map, compass, keys, or just cash. And it does all of this while rolling out a new roster of enemies that are greater in variety and challenge to those we fought outside before the dungeon. This stuff may all sound rudimentary, especially to those of us experienced players, but again, this is the game's first dungeon, and it may even be someone's first dungeon ever if they've never played another Zelda game before this. If that sounds silly, let's put this into perspective. As faithful and expertly modernized as the remake is, originally Link's Awakening was designed for the Game Boy. While yes, it is the 4th Zelda game, the NES, home of Zelda 1 and 2, saw lifetime sales of 61.9 million units. The Super Nintendo, which housed A Link to the Past, saw a lifetime sales of 49.1 million units. The Game Boy, however, exceeded more than both combined with 118.7 million units. It is to date the fourth best-selling game console ever. So when designing a Zelda title for that platform, it was almost certainly important for them to keep that barrier of entry in mind. There was likely to be a lot of new players who hadn't familiarized themselves with the tropes and standards that A Link to the Past had set precedent for. In simpler terms, it's more than likely that a lot of people experienced Link's Awakening as their first Zelda game. And when looking at the way this game handles its opening sequence and first dungeon, I can't help but feel that the devs anticipated as much. And that's great. It is good design that they can account for new players while still delivering a solid Zelda experience that seasoned players can get into without feeling like their hands are being so overtly held. That's a delicate balance, one that not every Zelda game manages to do, but Link's Awakening handles it just right. With Tail Cave out of the way, we're moving on to Bottle Grotto next, which compared to the excellent starter dungeon prior is a bit of a mixed bag. But before we get into that, a few pre-dungeon things to discuss. Most notably is Bow Wow. As soon as we return to Mabe Village, we're informed that he's been dognapped, and we have to go rescue him from some moblins. The way to their hideout is of course accessible now that we have the Rock's Feather, continuing the item gating progression that I mentioned last time. The moblin hideout includes what is almost a mini dungeon and boss fight, but it is really only a few rooms of enemies in actuality, though I do enjoy this boss moblin fight, which relies more on avoiding and waiting for the right moments to strike than brute force. A nice touch is that once we have Bow Wow, he can sniff out secrets for us, but really he's here to open the dungeon entrance for us. I won't lie though, having a pet Chain Chomp, however temporarily, is pretty damn fun. Chain Chomps in the Mario series are historically a major threat, so weaponizing that and turning said danger onto our enemies, that is simply satisfying to do. And that's about it. This one is pretty light on mandatory pre-dungeon stuff, but it does continue the trends set before Tail Cave. As for Bow Wow, we'll bring him home after the dungeon, but for now, we need him to get inside in the first place. So with these swamp flowers chomped, we can head into the dungeon. This is Bottle Grotto. Oh look, it's shaped like a bottle, I get it. And it's full of clay pots. I guess it could have just as easily been called Clay Pot Grotto, but that doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same way. I'll be honest. I don't love this dungeon. I wouldn't say I hate it either, but I'd rank it pretty low in terms of this game's dungeons. Coming off the heels of what was an excellent tutorial dungeon in Tail Cave, I find Bottle Grotto misses the mark on a lot of things. It isn't awful, it's passable, I guess, but it is definitely on the weaker side compared to some of the other more fun and interesting dungeons that this game has to offer. When we looked at Tail Cave, I mentioned how the dungeons are sometimes held back by the fact that their layouts are drawn in specific shapes. It wasn't an issue there, but it is here. The rigid adherence to making the dungeon bottle-shaped really holds it back from being able to do much with its navigation. Because of the shape, there's very little room for branching paths or puzzles that can span across multiple rooms. Instead, aside from a brief section at the beginning, it is strictly a straight linear path with no central room. This forces them to shoehorn in a couple of underground passages in order to connect certain areas, which is a bit of a band-aid solution. Now, that is not to say linearity is bad or anything like that, but there are more interesting ways to do it, and the best Zelda dungeons are the ones that find the right balance between linear sequences of challenges and open exploration. That balance is just not really what we get here. It's not all bad though. There's some really neat puzzle stuff that we get here, including the reintroduction of gem switches and barriers, making a return from A Link to the Past, which is a navigational puzzle mechanic that I adore. The Switch remake changes the colors of the switches and barriers to more align them with how they appeared in A Link to the Past, while in Link's Awakening DX, they are all blue, making them a little less distinct and easy to understand at a glance. Man, when it comes to puzzle mechanics, a little color coding goes a long way. The dungeon doesn't make the most incredible use of this mechanic. The puzzles with it are restricted to individual rooms, but it's also only serving to introduce us to the mechanic before later dungeons truly run with it. So in that sense, it is good. We are following the right trajectory in terms of difficulty curve. In terms of architecture and aesthetics, the dungeon is also a bit on the unremarkable side. The original even uses the same wafer cookie wall textures as Tail Cave, but with a cold blue tone. The Switch remake continues to lean into the stony cave look, but at least goes to the lengths to change the wall textures of the stone from the last dungeon. And hey, last time I said blue floor would look out of place in this art style, well, I retract that. We got exactly that here, and I think it looks great. It gives the whole place a different vibe from the first dungeon. Overall, in fact, I think the remake's color palette for this dungeon is solid. It only shines more with the added details like these little plants that grow here and there, and the water pooling at the dungeon entrance, which totally makes sense since there's a literal swamp right outside. The dungeon also, in a few instances, makes some great use of darkness with unlit torches, and has some really neat puzzles that require you to take the time to read into things and figure it out. That's all very good stuff. Another positive is the music. Oh, what a vibe. The original version of the track has this great effect where the volume pulses up and down, making almost a pseudo-Doppler effect. It makes the song feel tense and disorienting in a way. The track would actually fit in nicely with the likes of Super Mario World's Haunted Mansion levels. Oh hey, there's even some booze in here. It totally works. Considering the limitations of what sounds the Game Boy was even capable of producing, this track is a definitive example of working with what you've got and getting great results. But man, the remake's version is so good. Rather than an entire reorchestration, it takes the chiptunes from the Game Boy original and uses that as a foundation, then throws a ton of modern elements on top of it, and it nails it. It keeps that disorienting, spooky feeling and just adds more layers to give some oomph to it. This is how it's done. This is how you modernize Game Boy music. As for the overall progression, this is where things are a bit shakier for me. The dungeon starts out strong enough, with some locked doors and a couple of forks in the road, but these elements are short-lived, as aside from two little side rooms later on, this small section of the dungeon is where all of the zigzagging navigational challenge lies. The stone beak, which is essential here to figuring out a later puzzle, is tucked in this room to the far west, requiring a key to even access. There's a couple of other keys and locked doors providing us a bit of a tangled knot to work through. All the dungeon elements you'd expect are here. A small bit of backtracking, introductions to new mechanics, some new enemies to fight, all good stuff. It just falls apart once we get to this room on the far east side, because from here on out, aside from ducking into a couple of side rooms for the dungeon item and boss key, it's pretty much a straight shot shot through the rest of the dungeon, with no real branching paths. It seems more navigationally complex than it really is, due to these underground passages linking distant rooms. But since it's the only path to go on, it really makes no actual difference to the overall progression. And even in this room, where it seems like there's a fork in the road, this staircase is inaccessible initially. So again, there's actually only one path to take. Same thing happens here, where this path is blocked off until you duck into this side room for the dungeon item. So it just ends up being all rather uninteresting from a navigational standpoint. There's no sense of poking around and figuring things out, you're instead just being guided through these rooms. All of this may sound a bit hypocritical of me. I've certainly praised many dungeons before for doing, at least on the surface, exactly this. Many of A Link to the Past's dungeons follow this exact structure, an interconnected set of rooms with a navigational emphasis for the first part of the dungeon, followed by a more linear gauntlet of challenges leading up to the boss fight. At a glance, that is what is happening here as well, but in execution, it just never feels as well implemented as many of those dungeons did. Maybe it's because of the length of each section. In those many A Link to the Past dungeons that do this, the first section is always the main bulk of the dungeon, roughly about 2/3 of the total dungeon length, while the linear boss lead-up section tends to be a bit on the shorter side. Here it is very much the inverse, and because that navigational section is so short-lived, it never really gets interesting enough to make up for that latter part being rather lackluster. Worth discussing is the dungeon item. It's the power bracelet. This allows us to lift and throw heavy objects like rocks and the many clay pots found throughout the dungeon. This is not a bad item, but there's some trade-offs between versions. The original has a very nice tactile feel to it with its inputs. You have to push the button and then pull back with the D-pad, which sounds a bit awkward, but ends up feeling very natural, as the inputs match Link's movements quite nicely. It's a weird detail, but it really does feel good to do. The remake loses those additional inputs, but makes it so that the power bracelet is permanently auto-equipped, so you don't have to deal with the rather irritating inventory management side of things, which is a godsend. Though it still does little to save how squarely average the dungeon is, particularly in its second half. Again, it isn't bad. There are good elements like those gem switch puzzles, which start out pretty straightforward down here and then get iterated upon until you're switching these barriers multiple times in a single room. That's good stuff. I also like that the stone beak gets put to much better use here. The first use case is for a puzzle that's actually pretty easy to intuit already, but then later on you'll find that this puzzle is downright near impossible without the information this statue provides. Maybe it's spelled out for you a bit too heavy-handedly, but I do think having to get information from one section of the dungeon in order to solve a puzzle elsewhere is a nice touch. The Hinox makes an appearance and he's a blast to fight. They return from A Link to the Past and get promoted from common strong enemy to mid-boss. Their design is consistent from that last game, and they still hurl bombs at you, but they're also much larger and more dynamic here, being able to grab and throw you around. It's a nice change of pace, and makes for a pretty fun mid-boss. It's not too hard, we're still early on in the game, but he's no slouch either. So it's a mixed bag, but we've got to move on. So once we've made our way through these puzzles and traps, we can confront the dungeon boss. This absolute clown is the genie. He's a genie in a bottle, except he's a jerk. In all honesty, I just find this guy annoying. He's not an awful boss per se. The dungeon item actually gets put to really good use here, as you have to stun him, then pick the bottle up and smash it into the wall to deal damage. I think that's good. Probably the best way you could incorporate the power bracelet into a boss fight, though his dialogue was a little too heavy-handed spelling it out for you. I think if we were left to figure that that part out for ourselves, it might have been more interesting to do. He'll also zoom around the room and throw fireballs at you, overall acting a lot more aggressively than Moldorm did. Strangely, in the remake, I find that the fight is simultaneously made more dynamic, with the genie having a greater range of movement, as well as being a lot easier. The room is made just a bit larger and the torches removed, so I think the extra elbow room here allows you to avoid his attacks much more easily, reducing that overall difficulty. He also has a second phase after his bottle is shattered, in which he'll make a decoy of himself, but you really just have to wail on him until he dies, so there's not much to this. Sadly, I don't have a lot more to say about Genie. He's a nuisance, but a short-lived one, though he does kick off the trend of the dungeon bosses having a bit more personality, which plays into the game's story, so that's a nice touch. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the conch horn, the second of 8 instruments of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. And we're off to bring Bow Wow home. Good boy. So overall, Bottle Grotto is a mixed bag. It isn't a bad dungeon, but it never really feels better than average to me. The enemy variety overall is great, with some returning baddies from the previous dungeon and some new faces like these Stalfos Knights, and the Pole's Voice who you actually need the dungeon item to defeat. That's good stuff. In fact, there's a lot of good uses for the dungeon item. It's very well integrated into the level design, while also not sidelining the previous items that we've collected. From a design standpoint, that's fantastic. The downside, however, at least in the case of the original version, is that the game treats the power bracelet as an equipable item, meaning it has to take up one of those 2 precious item slots. You thought Ocarina of Time's iron boots were bad in the water temple? This frankly puts that to shame, forcing you to pause and equip this item just to lift up every little thing. The remake gets it right. You lose the tactile feeling of those additional inputs, but the bracelet is permanently auto-equipped, and the remake gives you a context-sensitive action button for use cases like lifting up items. Why this wasn't the case in the original? I don't know. A Link to the Past and heck, even Zelda 1 did it just fine, but sacrificing an item slot just to lift and throw clay pots is frankly atrocious, especially given the fact that your sword and shield are equally treated as equipable items too. I cannot stress enough how annoying the constant pausing to switch items on and off is. This is more of an issue with the Game Boy version of the game overall than with the actual dungeon. And in a way, these elements are a bit at odds with each other. The dungeons all make great, consistent use of your inventory and continue building puzzles that put all of Link's arsenal to use. Even this dungeon uses not just its own item, but also the magic powder and Rock's Feather, as well as balancing those puzzles out with a fair amount of combat. That's all good level design, but it is totally at odds with the game's terrible UI, and it's a bit disappointing to see this issue rear its head as early as the second dungeon. But as I mentioned, the remake really does fix this issue. You get 2 equipable item slots in addition to your sword and shield having permanent button mapping, and context-sensitive action-enhancing items like the power bracelet are permanently auto-equipped. In fact, I noticed while reviewing my footage that I didn't pause to switch items a single time when playing this on the Switch version, while in the DX version I had to do it in nearly every room and sometimes more than once in each room, just to put things into perspective. So, as I mentioned at the start of the series, my literal biggest complaint with this game is smoothed over. How nice. Despite those good design elements I mentioned, the dungeon is still held back by trying to adhere to the bottle layout. There are 3 staircase passageways to connect distant rooms, which ends up being a necessity as a workaround since the dungeon shape hugely restricts how they can lay things out. I frankly would have preferred it if they had not limited themselves to shaping the dungeon this way, and focused more on making the navigation interesting interesting, because the room-to-room moments are good. There's lots of torch lighting puzzles, a reintroduction of the red-blue gem switch barriers from A Link to the Past, and a handful of other little neat moments, like those little splits in the road at the beginning. They offer a lot of exploration, but the stone beak placement, I don't love. It feels like they just had to put rooms there in order to maintain that bottle shape, rather than it being a more natural integration into the layout. So while the dungeon is full of good moments, I just feel the overall bigger picture is somewhat lacking. Now that we have the power bracelet, a fair amount of Koholint Island will open up to us, giving us some much needed open exploration around the prairie. There's plenty of optional little goodies and secrets for us to gather, side content to engage in, including the photo booth if you're playing the DX version, and Dampé's Dungeon Builder minigame in the Switch remake. That's something I'll come back to in a later video. That said, exploring around here is wonderfully fun. Koholint can at times feel a bit restrictive with where you can go and what you can do, but as you get more items and open new paths and shortcuts, the island gradually feels a little less winding and twisting and a little more sprawling and open. It's a great approach that works very well for classic Zelda, furthering that item gating progression system that I've talked about already in the last two videos, which is nice. If you haven't already started into the game's trading sequence, you'll need to at this point in order to even gain access to the dungeon, since this guy Richard will task you with exploring Canalit Castle to retrieve his golden leaves, but you need monkeys to build a bridge for you. The castle is something of a mini dungeon, which is why I wanted to discuss it in a bit of detail here. If you played A Link to the Past, then the secret passageway around the back should feel pretty familiar, but once within the walls, we have a nice balance of design ideas in the castle, some open explorable space in the courtyards outside, and a linear combat gauntlet within the castle interior itself, which winds upstairs around the balcony and then up to this room where we square off against a ball and chain soldier. The castle is not a complex labyrinth, but as a sort of mini dungeon, it is a pretty enjoyable little excursion. This quest for Richard also acts in some ways like an item check, as he'll encourage you to get a shovel, which you'll need to find the slime key anyways, and the castle has some spots requiring bombs. Bombs will also be mandatory in Key Cavern as well, so the game forcing us to acquire them before we head that way is a good design choice. After that is a little challenge in the pothole field to get the dungeon key, which is fine. It satisfies my innate urge to cut grass, but something I'd like to point out is that the remake adds this tiny little shortcut here, right from where you get the slime key back to the lock that the key is used for. The original had us instead backtrack all the way through the way we came and back out Richard's villa, which is fine, but that little looping shortcut is a really nice touch from a level design standpoint, and makes the whole sequence feel a little more streamlined in a way that isn't unnatural. I appreciate it. But we're really here to talk about the dungeon itself. Once we have the slime key, yes, it's really called that, we can open this gate and head into the dungeon. Welcome to Key Cavern, the dungeon that holds the honor of containing the most small keys of any Zelda dungeon in history, with a whopping total of 9. Also, it is shaped like a key. While examining the previous 2 dungeons, I mentioned that the game trying to lay out the dungeons in specific shapes has at times held it back, like they're putting themselves in too much of a box. Not so much in Tail Cave, but in Bottle Grotto though, it was pretty noticeable. Here, it isn't actually an issue. That may be due to the key shape itself, which offers more flexibility for branching paths than Bottle Grotto did in its latter half. Plus, this is the game's first dungeon to have multiple floors, which gives the level designers even more elbow room to work with to make the navigation interesting. The dungeon consistently gives you options of where to go, with lots of little dead ends and obstacles in place that you will need to mentally take note of and then return to with the dungeon item. And the use of keys here is comparable to some of the series' best dungeons, like Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, which similarly had lots of locked doors, lots of open explorable space where we could find keys, and then a critical path that requires you to spend several small keys in a row to get through. It's not quite on the same scale here. Obviously, Key Cavern is much smaller than the Forest Temple, but it is that same design formula, and there's some inherent satisfaction to scouring this place, gathering keys, and then blasting through these locks. But let's back up a bit here and talk about the music. A commonality between the dungeon themes so far has been that alternation between danger and curiosity, which Key Cavern's theme does as well. In fact, Key Cavern has one of the more dramatic dungeon themes, certainly, but it is a bit on the weaker side for me. There's two main parts to it. The first one that alternates between these big bold phrases and more understated sections. And the second one, which feels a bit more inquisitive. They did a great job translating this piece for the remake, adding some really great flair to it. And leading into this almost off-kilter feel with the piano and synth choices. I would say that the original version of this song is just not the most memorable dungeon theme. There's nothing bad about it, but nothing that hooks me either. It does the job well enough though. The updated version for the remake, however, is a big improvement. The choices of instrumentation really elevates the piece for me, adding a great sense of unease, as it should. In terms of progression, the dungeon overall can be pretty neatly divided into two sections as well. The first section would be the shaft of the key, so to speak, which is a mostly linear section of halls, but still contains a handful of side rooms to check out, consistently providing us with either options of where to explore or teases of places we'll be able to get to later. This first section ends in this room downstairs, where the dungeon really lets go of your hand. There's 4 locked doors to choose from, and you'll only have a single key when you get here. The choice is really yours on which door to take, though that tension is somewhat artificial. Each room will replace the key you spent to get there. However, there is an extra safety key you can get right before the boss fight, but we'll come back to that. Anyways, the second section starts back upstairs, and this is where I would say the dungeon is at its best. There's a ton of explorable space, with just the right amount of obstacles and paths being locked. Between my 2 treks through this dungeon, I was able to tackle the rooms in this section in 2 completely different orders, which was awesome to do. In a way, this section could be considered the dungeon's central room, though it is somewhat segmented and deeper into the dungeon than most of its contemporaries. But in terms of how the different rooms of this section branch off from here, it is the closest thing this dungeon has. It's here that we'll find the dungeon's mid-boss, the Dodongo snakes. These guys are neat, though they're pretty passive as far as enemies go. You have to force feed them bombs until they quite literally explode, and that's about it. Though I'll never not be amused by the way they sometimes shake their heads to refuse a bomb snack. After defeating them, we'll find the dungeon item, the Pegasus boots, which return from A Link to the Past, giving us a little running dash ability. utility. Now, I'm sure you saw this talking point coming, but your experience here with this item will differ depending on which version you're playing due to the inventory management differences. In the original, it is treated as an equipable item just like everything else, which means you'll have to toggle it on and off from the menu when you need to use it. And that includes an instance where you need to use it in conjunction with the Roc's Feather to take a running jump over this gap, so you're going to have to put your sword away completely. I complained about the item management issue at length when talking about the power bracelet in Bottle Grotto, so I apologize for the redundancy, but hear me out. That item swapping only gets worse the more items you get. The dungeon makes use of many items, including your sword, bombs, the Roc's Feather, and Pegasus boots, though bombs and the boots get the most utility here, so it isn't quite as bad here as it could be. But it is still an issue. The Switch Remake permanently maps the boots to your L button, so you never have to bother equipping and unequipping them, and thank goodness for that. It's great to be able to dash at any time without having to fiddle around in menus first. Plus, he makes this cute little pitter-patter sound with his feet when winding up for a dash. I love that. And for everyone reminding me that this was a hardware limitation of the Game Boy, I am well aware of that. Though with the power bracelet, it was an easier complaint to make. The bracelet could have been auto-equipped and treated as a context-sensitive input, the same way that actions like opening chests or talking to NPCs make use of the A button as a context-sensitive action button. Treating it that way could remove the need to ever have to put it on or take it off. But in the case of the Pegasus boots, I'm not quite as sure about how they could have worked around it. It needs a dedicated input. Maybe double tapping on the D-pad direction you're moving could have worked, or something to that effect, similar to how you get into a sprint in Smash Bros. But that's the best proposal I've got. Either way, I'm glad to see this fixed in the remake. Again, I know it was a technical limitation of the Game Boy, which quite literally didn't have more buttons to work with, but that doesn't make it any less irritating to swap items constantly. And it also doesn't change the fact that the devs knew about this when making the game, and could have better designed their item systems to work within the confines of the hardware it was being created for. This is the last time I'll complain about this issue over the course of covering this game, otherwise these videos will get very repetitive. So just know that the item swapping will continue to be an issue for the rest of the game in the DX version, and it's something you'll either have to learn to look past, or consider just getting the Switch Remake if you can't. I wanted to also quickly mention that right before getting the item, there's this neat little push block puzzle. It's a very simple puzzle, but what I like about it is that it subtly blocks the way out behind you, giving you a small point of no return. So when you get the Pegasus boots, you're forced to use them in order to give yourself an exit. It's that same great sort of new item tutorialization that I mentioned way back in my Great Deku Tree video with the slingshot, locking you into this small space and making you use the item to get out. Anyways, with our newly acquired Pegasus boots, there's no section of the dungeon off limits anymore, as the boots allow us to destroy these weird things. I cannot find the name of them for the life of me, so I'm just gonna call them balloon rocks. We can use the boots to complete puzzles that we passed by earlier, to easily defeat enemies that were challenging to fight without them, as well as destroy balloon rocks to access new areas, and even combine them with the jumping power of the Roc's Feather to get the boss key. The Pegasus boots are a great item overall. I'm happy to see them make a return. There's also a few neat little environmental puzzles that teach you about using bombs effectively. We should know already by now that you can bomb cracked walls, but it's taken a step further here, teaching us that some walls may be destructible without having that visual tell, or sometimes that you can only see the cracks on one side, with either side being bombable. Case in point, this wall has a big arrow to point us towards it. This wall appears cracked from this side, but creates a shortcut back to the central room, and we can figure out that this wall is bombable because this balcony provides a preview of the room on the other side, showing us those cracks in the wall. It's a great way of using the environment to teach us things. And while the owl statue here does hint towards it somewhat, the hint it actually gives us is just that poking bombable walls with our sword produces a different sound. I love that kind of hint, because it's not just telling us to bomb that specific wall, but rather telling us how to figure out for ourselves which walls are destructible and which ones are not. That's how it should be done. Don't just give me the solution to a puzzle, but instead the tools to figure it out for myself. Alright, with all of that said and done, once we've smacked this guy out of the way, we can confront the dungeon boss. When we enter the boss room, the boss is initially nowhere to be found, only a voice taunting us, though little voles will drop from the ceiling as a hint, so we can use our newly acquired Pegasus boots to charge the wall and knock the boss from the ceiling. This is the Slime Eye, and he is perhaps the easiest boss in the game. But first, let's look at his visual design. In the DX version, he's got this very nice transparent effect, while the Switch remake swaps that out for an opaque, reflective, shiny surface. Both look good. It's neat getting the 360 of the room reflected like that, but I think the blue transparent look of the original might be a little bit cooler. Not sure why they opted for a dull gray in the remake. That said, he is basically a big eyeball monster, and if you've been keeping up with this series through all of the games I've covered already, then you'll know how I feel about that. It's frankly overdone. Thankfully, he is the only giant eyeball boss in this game, unlike A Link to the Past, which had 3. So it is pretty forgivable. But what I don't like about Slime Eye is how absurdly easy he is to defeat. You stab his eye a bunch so that he begins to undergo mitosis, then dash at his stretched out midsection with the boots to break him apart, and then just go ham on him with your sword until he dies. I guess the challenge lies in trying to figure out how to defeat him to begin with, which is fine, but then once you know, he's absolutely trivial to take down, and that undercuts the value of the fight on repeat playthroughs. Because if you come in armed with that knowledge, there's no challenge left. I like when puzzle elements bleed into my boss battles, but I would have liked to have had a little bit of both puzzle and combat challenge, not just one or the other. Alas, Slime Eye will go down very quickly. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the Sea Lily's Bell, the third instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. Overall, Key Cavern is a more than competent dungeon. Its structure is spot on, and it has a lot of great puzzles that require the player to pay attention to the environment and make mental notes of things to come back to after getting the dungeon item. That's great. There's lots of explorable space and branching paths with dead ends and keys galore, though there are a few missed opportunities that could have elevated this dungeon from a good one to an excellent one. For one, the dungeon has a bunch of conveyor belts that act as both obstacles and even a puzzle wrinkle to the combat in some rooms. That's cool, but it would have been cool to have used it in conjunction with the Pegasus boots. Perhaps having an extra fast conveyor belt somewhere in the dungeon as an item gate that we can only get past by dashing with the boots, or something to that effect. I do like that the Parod enemies are almost a puzzle to defeat in and of themselves, and then become a non-issue once you have the Pegasus boots. That is a great way of both making your dungeon item useful and giving the player a sense of becoming more powerful. And enemies that you have to approach strategically instead of just brute forcing through are always welcome. That's cool. I also am not a huge fan of where the map and compass are placed within the dungeon. It isn't the worst thing in the world, but I would have made the map obtainable a little sooner without the need to backtrack for it. The compass, meanwhile, is found in the deepest reaches of the dungeon, and aside from the small key in the next room, is probably the last thing you'll find before heading towards the boss fight. In essence, they're both found too late into the dungeon to truly be useful, because by the time you have them both, you've probably explored everywhere and mapped out the majority of the dungeon already. I suppose you could view it as a last-minute failsafe to make sure you can double-check if you've missed anything, but for me, finding it right at the end of the dungeon makes its inclusion feel more like a formality than something that is actually useful. Again, not the biggest deal since the rest of the dungeon is more than good enough to make up for it, but still worth a mention. Another very minor note, but when talking about Tail Cave, I mentioned how the remake adds seamless scrolling to larger rooms, so it is a bit odd to me that they only half do that here. This whole section of the dungeon is really one larger interconnected area, and some parts of it get the seamless scrolling treatment, while others still stick to the screen transitions. I don't really mind it too much. It may have been done to make sure the camera doesn't pan to things that they don't want you to see yet, but when going through this little corridor, it gets pretty jarring. And my final note is about keys. There is actually one more key than there is a locked door within the dungeon. That last one will drop right here in this room, right before the boss fight. That extra key actually confused me at first, but I think it is meant to be a failsafe for this section of the dungeon where you find 4 locked doors and you only have a single key. If you leave that right side room for last, then you won't need it. But if you didn't do that, then you'll have a chance to go explore those rooms that you missed out on. Since each of those 3 rooms replenishes the key spent to enter it, the math still works out that you'll always have an extra key if you explore every room. But I get the idea here, as players could potentially be locked out of ever seeing one of those rooms otherwise, even if they aren't critical to progression. That note isn't really a complaint, just a funny little quirk of the dungeon. Otherwise, Cavern is a very good dungeon, and while it has a few very minor flaws, it lays down the groundwork that some of this series' all-time best dungeons would follow, and puts the excellent lock and key system to use. Link's Awakening was originally released on the Game Boy in 1993, but that Game Boy release also happens to be the one version of the game that I'm not playing for this video series. 5 years later, Link's Awakening was to be re-released on the Game Boy Color, and aside from the added, well, color, they further sought to incentivize players to repurchase the game by including a brand new, albeit optional, dungeon. The aptly named Color Dungeon. I was a bit conflicted initially about when during this series to cover this dungeon. Part of me felt that it should be done last, since it is an optional dungeon that is not even available in all versions of the game. So in many ways, it is an outlier. Therefore, it could make some sense to draw a clear division there between this and the main story dungeons. But on the other hand, I'm sure these days the majority of people who have played Link's Awakening have played one of the many re-releases that includes this dungeon, and while it can be done at pretty well any point onwards, right after Cavern is the earliest it can be accessed through normal means. So it would also make sense to cover it here and now, between Cavern and Angler's Tunnel, when most players would likely play through it. I was indecisive, so in the end I ran a poll, with the results heavily in favor of that latter option. So thank you to everyone who voted and left a comment. Actually gaining access to the dungeon is simple. In something of a callback to the Book of Medora in A Link to the Past, we can use the Pegasus boots to knock this book off the shelf in the Mabe library and read this hint. The numbers and arrows simply correspond to the sequence and directions that we need to push these headstones in the graveyard. And that's about it. As near as I can tell, the order is consistent across playthroughs as well, unlike the Windfish's Egg, so technically you could get in here sooner if you simply memorize the directions or brute force through it, as some people have pointed out to me that they did. But on an average playthrough, accounting for when the game feeds you this info, this is the soonest you could reasonably get here. But once you know, it's quite simple. So that's about it. Once we've completed this puzzle, watch out for the Guineas, we can head down into the dungeon. This is the Colour Dungeon, and it's alright. In terms of its overall structure, it has some neat things going on, and isn't tied down to being shaped after a particular object like the previous dungeons have been. However, it isn't a dungeon I would rank very highly compared to the rest of this game's offerings. But first, the dungeon music. The theme here is a remix of the main dungeon theme from the original NES Legend of Zelda. Honestly, I like it. Maybe it's my nostalgia for Zelda 1, but I think it's a good fit for this dungeon, which compared to the others in this game, feels the most like a Zelda 1 dungeon in terms of the layout and navigation. The Switch remake once again faithfully updates the track, giving it just a bit of extra depth. I particularly like this section of the track, which I don't think was in the NES original. It takes a break from the deep brass and strings to give way for a less dramatic and more melancholic feeling. This also works to keep the track in line with the rest of this game's dungeon themes, having that alternation between tension and curiosity, which is exactly the right mood for a dungeon theme. As for the color theme, the dungeon mostly uses this fairly well, but it all comes across as pretty superficial to me. We have color-based puzzles, enemies who blend into the color of the floor tiles in some areas, color coding to indicate hazards, and a color-based reward at the end of the dungeon. But that's about it. I see what they were going for, but a theme like color is pretty vague, and the idea falls apart when you realize the way that the remake downplays the significance of said color theming. Most of the color-based puzzles and hazards have other visual tells added in addition to the coloration. There's cracks added to the collapsing floor tiles to indicate how close they are to breaking, and shapes to match for these color puzzles, both with the orb monsters that we toss into these holes, and with these rotating switch puzzles, where we have to make them all match. Don't get me wrong, I like that they added these extra visual indicators. Colorblind people exist, and there's a good chance that this dungeon was a true struggle without those changes. So this was likely an accessibility thing, and that's welcome in my books. But it also further highlights the superficiality of that theming. though one decent use of color is with these blobby enemies called camo goblins, where they blend in with certain sections of the floor, which again, neat concept, but something that doesn't get put to use in a very interesting way. Ironically, this is a concept that would later be better realized in the Oracle games. But I digress. Visually speaking, I find it overall kind of bland looking. The DX version has this grainy wall texture and gray flagstone floor, and it just isn't that interesting to look at most of the time. For a place called Color Dungeon, it just isn't all that colorful, though I do like these vibrant, magic-looking floor tiles here and there. Those look great. The remake is a little better to look at overall, and I really mean only a little, though those aforementioned floor tiles get changed up here, and I have mixed feelings about that. The patterns are changed to differ color to color, which I like, but they are static now instead of having that neat little magic effect. It's not the biggest deal, but I guess the rest of the architecture is so bland that these little bits of flair stood out to me. They still look nice though, and I'll take any bit of color that I can get in this place. As for navigation, the dungeon has what I'm calling a two-pronged design. You'll reach a point with a fork in the road and two main paths that you can take, which both take you into mid-boss fights. One path ultimately leads towards the dungeon boss, while the other one has the boss key. I like that the dungeon lets you do quite a bit of exploration and potentially could let you get all the way up to the boss door without the boss key. Though these two paths are the main critical paths, there's still a good few splits in the road here and there with side rooms, which you'll need to explore to get small keys and even the map. That stuff is all good in my books. I like the feeling of poking around and just being able to explore until I hit dead ends, though I do think that some of these locked doors should not be quite so deep into each route, so that you know just a little bit sooner when you need to turn around, backtrack, and find some more keys, especially since the dungeon doesn't have any sort of central room or hub area, so that time spent backtracking can add up quite a bit. I think this little loop in the path near the start of the dungeon is great, a nice streamlined bit of design in the layout, where we see a locked door, explore and find a key, then get dropped back here through this one-way door. But we're also shown a different fork in the road in that east section, so there's some great decision making on which path to take. That's all good stuff. It just would have been nice for them to add in at least one more loop in the path like that, maybe after getting the boss key, for example. So there's some good elements at play here. The issue is that the dungeon just doesn't do much with any of it. Every puzzle is limited to being an individual room puzzle, either as a means to obtain a key or simply open the door in front of you, and the hazards and puzzles are recycled in a way that just isn't all that interesting. The best of the bunch are these color matching puzzles with these rotating switches, and while they do start simple and then get iterated upon, you can really only take this mechanic so far. There's also a single one of these gem switches, which are usually used nicely for multi-room puzzles, but it's used only in this one room to do this. And those are colorful puzzle elements. They could have built that into the dungeon in a really interesting way, but they just don't do anything with it. They don't even introduce it until the last room before the boss fight. And I think that's the main issue here. They don't really commit to any mechanics or design ideas. The dungeon is like a sampler pack of puzzle ideas and concepts that lacks any cohesion. And aside from finding the handfuls of small keys, nothing you do in any one room matters outside of that room. There are no puzzles that have any impact on the rest of the dungeon. The lack of a dungeon item here doesn't help matters either. There's no unique new ability or mechanic that puzzles could be based around with that either. And I get that they have the reward at the end of the dungeon, which could be seen as the dungeon item, but that's only going to help us after the dungeon, not during the dungeon. Probably the coolest thing about the dungeon is the combat focus. Like how these enemies will slowly destroy the floor tiles, both increasing the amount of hazards as well as adding a sense of urgency to fighting them, and the inclusion of not one, but two mid-bosses. Those are Avalanche, aka the Stone Hinox, and the Giant Buzzblob. Avalanche is pretty straightforward to fight, but there are a lot of hazards in the room, such as falling rocks and spikes on the floor. So this battle is more about being mindful of your positioning, avoiding taking damage, and striking when possible. As for the Giant Buzzblob, he has two forms. In the first one, he is invulnerable to your attacks, so you have to use magic powder to change him to his second form, which is when you'll be able to attack. His attacks are a lot less aggressive compared to Avalanche, so this fight feels a little more strategic instead of skill-based. So in a sense, these two mid-bosses cover a bit of both styles, and that's cool. But aside from that, there isn't a whole lot else going for this place. The navigation is just not that complicated or interesting, which after Key Cavern feels like a noticeable dip in the difficulty curve, alas. Once we've beaten both mid-bosses and made our way through these puzzles and traps, we can confront the dungeon boss. This is the hard-hit beetle. And that was the hard-hit beetle. So yeah, last time I said that Slime Eye might be the easiest boss in the game, with an asterisk that I would have to reevaluate that after Angler's Tunnel. But I guess I forgot about Hard Hit Beetle because, jeez, what a pushover. I guess the angle here is that he's trying to play mind games with you. He tells you to back off and take your time, but really, you can just keep attacking him, and he dies really quickly. He also changes color as he takes damage, and this could have been an opportunity to incorporate some sort of color-based puzzle element into the fight, but that just doesn't happen. Nothing really happens. Heck, the color aspect is so meaningless that they straight up remove mention of it in the remake. It's too bad too, because he's designed to be a giant version of a hard hat beetle, who are notoriously annoying enemies in 2D Zelda. So why is he such a pushover? Why are both mid-bosses harder than the dungeon boss itself? How would I fix it? Here's an idea. Remember those magic-looking colored floor tiles? Let's put those around the room. Have him keep changing color, but make it so that he's only vulnerable when standing on the corresponding colored floor tile, and incorporate the rubbery knockback mechanic that common hard hat beetles have. And you could put some pitfalls around the room too if you want to make things a little harder. Then, the fight becomes about strategically positioning yourself and the boss in order to deal damage. The color theme would actually matter, and the fight might have some real challenge to it. If we're worried about keeping it in line with the rest of the color-based puzzles for the sake of accessibility, then you can add some shapes or patterns on them that we can use as well. But of course, that's just not what we get here. Instead, just wail on him with your sword, and he will go down very quickly. Once he's defeated, we'll get our... Wait, no heart container? Okay, I realize that in the DX version, they were kind of already locked into the original version's heart capacity, so they couldn't add in a new heart container, but they greatly increased the max heart count in the Switch remake. They really couldn't have thrown a heart container in here? Really? But what we will get is a choice between the red and blue mail. Red improves your attack power, while blue offers damage reduction. Essentially, offense versus defense. The choice is yours, and I think that's a really cool reward. I go for blue personally. I like the look, and since we'll get a different attack increase later, I like to balance it out. Plus, most common enemies are not strong enough for you to see the benefit of both attack buffs stacked anyways. But that's just me, but I like that it lets you choose. Overall, the Colour dungeon is okay. In many ways, it feels like a Zelda 1 dungeon, with its lack of a general theme or even larger rooms, which feels like something of a regression from how the level design has gradually evolved over the course of the NES titles, A Link to the Past, and then this game. And frankly, some of these rooms feel like pointless filler. But the main issue is that the dungeon doesn't feel like it commits to anything. This can be seen as early as the first room, where these two skeletons, humorously named Gar and Dion, will tell you to stock up on magic powder and even offer to sell you some, but you can find some for free in the next room. And magic powder is only used during one of the two mid-bosses, not for any puzzles. The navigation just isn't that complicated, but there are long stretches of paths to take on either of the two prongs, which trips me up a little. I always want to explore as thoroughly as possible in a dungeon, so I tend to end up feeling like I've gone too far down either critical path and missed something, and then I end up backtracking way more than necessary. That's on me, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who plays this dungeon, finds a split in a path, gets 4 rooms deep into one of them, and then worries that they've gone too far in a single direction, and then turns around. Moving a few of those locked doors to be just a room or two sooner could potentially alleviate that, or just add more keys and locked doors entirely instead of moving the ones that are already there. That could work too. I also personally think the map and compass locations should have been swapped, just to make the navigation that much more intuitive. It feels like we find the compass way too soon and the map way too late. Probably my favorite aspect of the dungeon though is the rotating color switch puzzles. I love this type of thing. It really demands that you gain an understanding of how it works, and is for sure the sort of puzzle that will be way harder to brute force through than to just take a moment to think about. That's great. But overall, the color theming and heck, pretty much the rest of the dungeon just ends up feeling shallow and underdeveloped. To sum it up, it has some good rooms, some fun moments with good puzzles, but overall, as one larger picture, the dungeon strangely feels lesser than the sum of its parts. Oh wait, it's totally shaped like a shirt, like Link's tunic, like the end reward. How did I not notice that sooner? As was the case with the power bracelet after Bottle Grotto, our recently acquired Pegasus boots from Key Cavern will give us access to new areas of Koholint Island. But in order to get into the next dungeon, we'll need to find the key. A nice detail that I'm quite fond of is that the dungeon entrance, while locked and inaccessible, can be stumbled upon long before this point, and will likely be a memorable landmark that will stick out in players' heads. In order to find that key, we'll have to make our way over to the Yarna Desert, out past Animal Village, in the far southeastern corner of the island. There's a fair amount of exploration required to get here, with this underground passage being somewhat obscure, but nothing a bit of sleuthing can't solve. The highlight here, though, is escorting Marin to Animal Village, so she can get this walrus to move out of the way for you. There's something incredibly charming about these scenes with Marin, and the little bits of commentary and dialogue she will give you. There's a lot of heart in these moments. In the desert, we'll end up having to take on an overworld boss, the Land Mola, who guards the Angler Key. Although, unlike when we fought Land Molas in A Link to the Past, there's only a single one here instead of 3. He's not too hard of a boss to fight, but it's a neat shakeup to have him out here in the overworld, and the sink sand in this little arena adds a nice little environmental hazard to the fight. I like it. With the angler key in our hands, we can return to Telltale Heights to unlock the dungeon entrance, but there's still a bit of work to be done to get inside. The keyhole is placed on this ledge, but the actual entrance is not accessible from here, so we have to explore through these caves in the Telltale Mountains to make our way above the dungeon and then jump down to the entrance. Just as was the case with A Link to the Past's Death Mountain, there's a lot of fun to be had weaving in and out of these caves and mountain ranges, which are all packed with secrets and goodies. And there are some really nice cinematic moments here. I can only imagine the impression that this must have left on players back in 1993. It's lovely, and I have to say that this is my favorite dungeon lead-up quest in the game so far. It's for the most part all very exploration heavy and engaging, and the moments that aren't are instead charming and, dare I say, intimate even? Either way, I'm a big fan. So once we've taken this leap down, we can head into the dungeon. This is Angler's Tunnel, and aside from the boss fight, which we'll come back to that, this dungeon does nearly everything right. What is it about 4th dungeons in Zelda games being so good? In terms of architecture, I quite like it here in either version. The original has this nice teal and blue color palette, which I love. As far as what the Game Boy could achieve, this is a downright nice looking dungeon. The colors really pop. The remake reinterprets it to lean more into the stony cave wall aesthetic that the first 2 dungeons had, but still differentiates itself by adding plant overgrowth everywhere, as well as a fair amount of extra detail and flourish. These 2 versions are pretty different in that respect, but I like them both. I think the teal and blue stands out a bit more, but the added details of the remake, especially the greenery all over the place, are really easy on the eyes too, and a good fit for a water dungeon like this. We also have a perfectly tuned sense of progression up the difficulty curve with this dungeon, both in how it handles its navigational focus, as well as the enemy variety, with new enemies introduced here such as Peahats, Water Tektites, and Helmasaurs, as well as a collection of familiar baddies that we've fought already. But before we get into all of the ways that this dungeon frankly excels, let's talk about the music for a moment. Something I've only briefly mentioned before is that the dungeon themes so far have sprinkled in bits of the cave theme here and there, and integrated it into a larger, more complex dungeon theme, often alternating between that and something a little more tense. Now, I like the cave theme. It's mysterious. It's already a perfect vibe in the original version. And as you'd expect, it gets a nice glow up in the remake, where the instrumentation gives it more depth while still being faithful to the original composition. Great. What I like less is how the theme for Angler's Tunnel, at least on the Game Boy, is just still the cave theme. It's faster and higher pitch, but it doesn't feel like a smartly integrated thematic inclusion like has been done with the other dungeon themes so far. It just feels like the cave theme, but sped up. The remake, however, updates the track in a brilliant way. It basically keeps the Game Boy chiptune version of the song intact, uses that as a starting line, and then says, hey, let's write a water level theme here for real this time. And the results are beautiful. There's some harp and calming string movements and brass that washes over the whole thing. If not for just how good some of the upcoming dungeon themes are, I'd say this one would be my favorite in the game. But, well, just you wait. We'll get to those dungeons. Point is, the updated theme for Angler's Tunnel is gorgeous and atmospheric, and a huge improvement over the Nothing Burger that was the original. But most importantly, it fits this dungeon perfectly. As for actually playing through the dungeon, it's really good. And it's always been good. In broad strokes, the dungeon is shaped like a fish, but it certainly is not held back by that. It has a large central room that everything branches off from, lots of twisting, winding, navigation, crisscrossing, loops in the path and shortcuts, lots of keys and locked doors, obstacles that you need the dungeon item for, ability item gating progression, everything you'd want in a navigation-focused dungeon is here. It's a big tangled knot that you've got to pick apart, and I love it. Something I think the dungeon does exceptionally well is what I've often referred to as the old treasure chest tease, though in the case of this place, they use it for more than just treasure chests. In short, the layout is made in such a way that you can often see enticing things before you can actually reach them, playing to your natural sense of curiosity. For example, we can see the chest with the boss key from as early as the second room, and regardless of which of the branching paths you take from the start, you'll see glimpses of things you could get by taking the other path. So if you went through these lower doors first, you would see this chest out of reach, and if you went up the stairs and around the balcony first, you'll get to see glimpses of these rooms and even the main central room. In either path, you'll get teased by this plus-shaped intersection, which you can only pass straight through, but in either case, you can see that there is another way to go. This stuff all keeps you constantly mindful of the bigger picture as you explore the dungeon. No matter which way you take, while you may hit some dead ends and have to turn around, you'll always make some amount of progress. You'll still find something worthwhile while exploring any of these branching paths. You'll just have to make sure to check all of them eventually in order to fully complete the dungeon. But the order in which you do that is up to you. One of the biggest differences I noted between the two versions of Angler's Tunnel is how the remake's added seamless scrolling impacts the dungeon experience. I think it's great, though sometimes screen transitions are still used, as has been the case throughout all of the dungeons. But I think I'd rather they had just gone all in on the seamlessness in this case, as it's one of those updates that really feels like it enhances the overall experience. And with the way the dungeon is always teasing you by showing you things you can't reach yet, ditching the screen transitions to keep that seamlessness intact wouldn't harm anything. There's nothing they need to keep out of view, but that's a very minor nitpick of mine. Much like exploring the overworld at large, there's a real great sense of progression here with how the dungeon item is integrated. Maybe the best in the game so far. Initially, only about half of the dungeon is explorable. You'll need to check every corner of what you can explore in order to gather keys. All the while, the layout is teasing you with places that you'll have to come back to later, like the boss door, which you can catch a glimpse of from this ledge here, this door across the deep water, which you'll have to walk past, this room with a puzzle you can't solve yet, and even a key that drops into the water of an underground room, which you can't grab yet, but they make a big show of it, so it should be memorable. They let you roam freely and slowly pick apart this tangled knot until you face the mid-boss, Cue-Ball, aka the Hydrosaur. Now, this guy is a fairly straightforward mid-boss, and in many ways, feels like a precursor to the big octo that we fight in Jabu Jabu's belly in Ocarina of Time. Essentially, he'll take laps around this loop of an arena, and only his backside is vulnerable. As long as you're quick and strike carefully, you can get him from the sides and take him down. While not too challenging, he works pretty well as a mid-boss that you have to fight by being mindful of your positioning. Defeating him will reward us with the dungeon item, the flippers, which, as you'd expect, allow us to swim. Now suddenly the entire dungeon is open to us. Marvelous. See, Angler's Tunnel has used deep water as both a hazard and a way of denying us access to certain areas, and has been doing this consistently from the start. With the ability to swim, however, no part of this dungeon is off limits, so areas that were previously hazardous can be swam through with ease, removing that obstacle. And several new paths are accessible or even just have new shortcuts that we can swim across. And to top it all off, the flippers are permanently auto-equipped, meaning there's no fiddling around with menus here. I know, I said I wasn't going to complain about the inventory management anymore. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just saying that in this instance, it isn't an issue. And I'm so happy about that. It's not complaining to say when something isn't a problem, right? Anyway, now we can gather any remaining keys and scoop up the contents of treasure chests that we couldn't reach before. Just a few more details to highlight. I like these little loops in the room layouts, especially with the floor pad puzzles, which we first walk past earlier and then find ourselves here where the puzzle solution is found, only again to be dropped back here in this adjoining room where we can either return to the central room to explore more or head back to that initial puzzle room. And then there's this little loop here where we find the boss key, which drops us back near the path towards the boss door. Moments like these are where the progression really feels like it gets neatly wrapped up, like it's all coming together in a comprehensive way. And since the dungeon has been teasing us with glimpses of things all the way through, there's a real satisfaction to it. With all of that said, there's only one slight detour before the end of the dungeon. So with everything else done, we can head down these stairs and confront the dungeon boss. This is the anglerfish, and he's dead. Okay, wait. I had picked up a piece of power in the previous room, so I was dealing double damage. Let's rewind, let the effect wear off, and try again. Here we go. This is the anglerfish, and oh, okay, he's dead. So yeah, there's barely a fight to talk about here. In fact, I would argue that this is not even a fight. It's an execution. And this is after I chose a defense boost in the color dungeon instead of an offense boost. But yeah, there's very little to say about the anglerfish. He looks kinda cool during the 15 seconds that he's on screen, and I guess the atmosphere of the fight is good. It's got that deep, dark underwater thing going on. So if that's your phobia, I can see that playing into it. Grotto did a very good job of dressing up the room in the remake, but yeesh! Remember how I said Slime Eye might be the easiest boss in the game? With an asterisk that I'd have to re-examine that after Angler's Tunnel? Well, consider it re-examined. At least Slime Eye had a puzzle element incorporated into the fight. I don't think there's much figuring out how to defeat the anglerfish. You just whack his big, glowing, obvious weak point, and he dies. This might not just be the easiest boss in the game, it might very well be the easiest dungeon boss in the entire series. Oh well, can't win them all. Anyways, once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll get the surf harp, the fourth instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So aside from the boss fight, Angler's Tunnel is overall a near perfect dungeon. There's lots of interconnectivity and crisscrossing navigation, which I love, all of which is built around a large and memorable central room. It's exactly this type of structure that I mean when I talk about the satisfying feeling of picking apart a big tangled knot. The dungeon constantly teases you with glimpses of other areas and treasure chests that are out of reach, tying together its layout and sense of progression by constantly enticing you forward. There's also an excellent balance between open, explorable space and inaccessible areas, with plenty of locks and small keys, and the water itself serving as an item gate, with the flippers later granting access to all of those new areas. Fantastic stuff. And while getting small keys is pretty standard when it comes to dungeon progression, I enjoy the way this dungeon turns something as simple as that into a memorable moment. Like when we have to make this jump with the Pegasus boots to get into this side room for a pair of keys, or when this key falls into the underground passage and landing just out of reach until you get the flippers. Putting such emphasis on those moments makes it feel so satisfying to just collect those keys. I think this floor pad puzzle is pretty neat. I think it could be brute forced through, in theory, though I've never tested it, since the tile order appears to be random from playthrough to playthrough. Though I'm usually not a huge fan of a puzzle simply being that you have to take note of something in one room and replicate it elsewhere. It just makes it a little less exciting to figure out, but it's not an outright design sin either, and Link's Awakening doesn't do it too often, whereas games like Phantom Hourglass kind of use that puzzle philosophy as a crutch. But I digress. I do like the way the dungeon trails you past it initially, making it stick out in your head, only to loop you back here later with the knowledge you need in hand. Most importantly though, the interconnected open layout of this place makes it all feel like a natural setting, one that I really enjoy exploring and combing through. Letting your players constantly see other parts of the dungeon gives them consistent landmarks and points of reference, making it all feel cohesive in a way. You always know where you are in relation to other parts of the dungeon. So overall, despite that boss fight being extremely lackluster, I just can't help but love this dungeon. Unlike the last handful of dungeons, the path to Catfish's Maw is pretty minimal. This is the game giving us an opportunity to engage with its bountiful supply of side content by steering us away from the dungeon for a moment. And with so much of Koholint available for us to explore, there's plenty we can choose to do. Before we can head into the dungeon, we'll at least need to help this ghost who appears before us after Angler's Tunnel, asking to be taken back to their home on the beach. In the original version, the ghost makes this creepy, haunting noise after every screen transition, which can genuinely get annoying. This was toned down substantially in the remake, thankfully, but otherwise this plays out relatively the same. Although the ghost seems to be more forthcoming with its dialogue in the remake, whereas it takes a little while for that dialogue to trigger in DX. That said, I definitely recommend taking the opportunity to interact with all of the side content that you can at this point. The dungeon entrance itself is easy to get to, so it'll be there, but we're given some time to breathe. And I think that serves the game's overall pacing very well. Aside from that, once we've helped this ghost out returning to its home, and then its grave, we're free to enter the dungeon at our leisure. We can do so by using our recently acquired flippers to dive through this underwater passageway. So with all of that said, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to Catfish's Maw, Link's Awakening's largest dungeon yet. And it's pretty dang good. This dungeon has a heavy exploration focus with lots of crisscrossing, forks in the road, and rooms that we'll have to revisit multiple times. But before we get into that, let's just quickly talk about the dungeon music. First thing to note is that this is the game's first dungeon theme, aside from the Color dungeon, that doesn't reference or incorporate the cave motif at all, which I'm okay with. We're into the second half of the game's dungeons now, and something a little different is welcome. The track has this great feeling of tension that never really lets up, mostly by using a bass line that fades in and out, adding a sort of disorienting feeling to the track, with little phrases thrown in to keep it all grounded and interesting. This is a prime example of game music being perfectly tailored for the hardware it's on. The Game Boy has a pretty limited range of sounds that it can make, but this song works within those limitations and creates something genuinely tense, like danger is always just around the corner. It's a great piece, and as you'd expect, the remake faithfully updates the track, using elements from the original while also incorporating modern instrumentation to give it some extra oomph. Which is more in line with how the first 3 dungeons updated their music, compared to how Angler's Tunnel took more creative liberties. There's not much more I can really say about this that I haven't already about the previous dungeon themes, but it really is masterfully done, and the choices of instrumentation are perfect. That rising and falling tension is captured so well here, with elements of intrigue sprinkled throughout it. It's a great piece of dungeon music. In terms of aesthetics, Catfish's Maw opts for a fairly naturalistic approach in both versions. The whole place has a sandy floor with puddles and little streams of water, with stone floor tiles being used sparingly, and typically meant to direct the player towards specific points of interest. Though they have once again reused the same stone wall texture that we saw back in Tail Cave, as well as a great deal of normal caves, though this time with a purplish hue. The same can be said with DX, which uses the same wafer cookie walls, though a little browner than purple. I do appreciate that the remake adds some plant life here and there as accents to highlight that naturalistic look even more, though I do wish they'd taken the idea just a bit further here and there. For the most part, I'm glad they kept the layouts and floor plans as one-to-one with the original as possible, but in cases like these little streams of water and puddles, them being so square feels a little strange. It's easy to overlook on the Game Boy. Everything is on a grid and in a pixel art style, so streams of water and puddles being perfectly square isn't that out of place. But in the remake's art style, it looks pretty strange for the water to have corners like that. I guess I would have just liked for them to have rounded it out a bit more, just to make it look a little bit more natural. With the exception of this room, the water here in all versions is purely for aesthetic. It has no impact on the gameplay, so changing it like that wouldn't harm anything. But that's a pretty minor nitpick. Otherwise, I think they did a great job of updating this dungeon for the remake. It looks great. The dungeon progression is overall very well designed, especially considering it lacks a core central room from which the navigation can all branch away from. Instead, we have lots of branching paths and forks in the road, with rooms often being reachable but not fully explorable without the dungeon item or necessary keys, the usual trimmings of a navigationally focused dungeon. At times, this place can be downright labyrinthian, which for me is a lot of fun. I swear I haven't had to lean on using the map and compass to keep track of my progress this heavily since the Water Temple in Ocarina of of time, especially towards the end of the dungeon. Using the compass to seek out treasure chests and keys ends up being vital. There are also multiple stairways and underground passageways to connect distant areas. To be more precise, there are 4 of these passageways, and by extension, 8 staircases. Well, 7 staircases and 1 pool of water. If I'm being honest, I'm not a huge fan of these. I find it tends to make the navigation feel less natural and makes the layout feel disjointed in a way. It's almost certainly a byproduct of them trying to maintain the dungeon shape, but it feels like a band-aid solution to me. I can usually look past 1 or 2 of these, but 4 is bordering on excessive. And honestly, at times it undermines how useful the map is when you can't reliably use said map to plot out a path to certain rooms. In the remake, this is definitely alleviated by the ability to leave pins in the map, so you can note for yourself which staircases connect to each other. In fact, it ends up being invaluable to do so, but in the case of the original, which does not have a dedicated map screen, this corner of your pause menu is all you get. Don't get me wrong, I like the dungeon being so exploration heavy. I just don't love the way these passageways make the layout feel nonsensical and disjointed. Come to think of it, it's more or less the same complaint I had with some of A Link to the Past's dungeons and their over-reliance on teleport paths. So for the sake of being constructive, here's an idea on how I would improve that. Either move the connected rooms to be right next to each other instead of way across the dungeon, or take out those stairways entirely and just have the rooms connected to each other properly with standard doors. We could also take the approach that they did with Cavern, and instead of having underground passageways that don't even appear on the map, just incorporate a second floor into the dungeon floor plan that these stairways could connect to and from. I think all of these suggestions would of course require the dungeon to not be so boxed in by the dungeon shape. In this case, I guess it's supposed to be shaped like a catfish, right? With his mouth open. My point is that, like Bottle Grotto, the level designers trying to maintain the dungeon shape seems to be what holds this dungeon back. And I really think that if they hadn't done it this way, that it would elevate this from a very good dungeon to an excellent one. But that's just me. And since that isn't what we got, then I'll just have to reiterate that the use of map markers in the remake is going to improve the overall experience greatly. Like Angler's Tunnel, this dungeon also uses the old treasure chest tease to a great effect, constantly having you walk past treasures that you can see but can't quite reach. I've talked a lot about this concept at length when examining Angler's Tunnel already, so I won't dwell on it a ton more here, aside from saying that it plays into that satisfaction once we do have the dungeon item, because at that point when we do get it, we'll have been able to visit quite literally every room that has a treasure chest. And in essence, this dungeon uses bottomless pits as an obstacle in much the same way that Angler's Tunnel did with its deep water. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the way you actually obtain the dungeon item in the first place, because this dungeon does something pretty interesting with that. The dungeon has 2 mid-bosses, but it's the first one that we're concerned with for the moment, the Master Stalfos. The fights with him are not incredible in and of themselves. He's fought pretty much the same way that you fight regular Stalfos knights, wherein you need to wait for the right moment to strike with your sword, and then bomb him when he's collapsed. Nothing spectacular, though honestly I think he looks pretty dang cool. What's more interesting is the level of intelligence that he seems to display. First off, he has apparently stolen the dungeon item from the chest where you would typically find it, which is a nice little moment that subverts your usual expectations. There are 4 empty rooms throughout the dungeon, each noted with a number of special tiles or blocks, depending on the version, to indicate the order in which he'll appear in each room. Long story short, there's something of a wild goose chase happening here. As we'll fight him in each room in sequence, he will flee after a certain point, and we'll need to hunt him down to fight him again. I like that we can actually find the empty room number 4 first, and then encounter him in room number 1, with room number 2 being pretty close by as well. Hopefully with all of that context, players can piece together what they need to do. I like this concept overall, and that they don't use objective markers to point you towards each of the rooms in order, but instead leave it up to the players to explore and piece it together for themselves. And I don't think we've gotten a dungeon scenario quite like this ever again. If every dungeon did this, then I think the concept would wear a bit thin, but this being something unique to Catfish's Maw works for me, and gives the dungeon its own gimmick to build its progression around. And just to reiterate, as we explore and hunt him down, we're passing by all of these out-of-reach treasure chests. They're just sitting there, taunting us. Once he's defeated for good, we'll get to the dungeon item that he stole. And yup, it's the hookshot, my beloved. There's a reason this thing is a fan favorite item in just about every game that features it. It's so fun. In the context of this dungeon though, it's put to particularly good use. Now we can cross all of those bottomless pits to reach new areas and open those treasure chests that we couldn't reach before. It can be used to retrieve items, pull on these extendable bridges, and makes fighting certain enemies, such as these Helmosaurs, much easier by removing their masks. Like I said about the Pegasus boots, the dungeon item both feels extremely useful and makes the player feel like they've grown more powerful, since it has use cases for puzzles, exploration, and even combat. It's a great item, I'll never stop praising it. Speaking of using the hookshot for combat, let's talk about the second mid-boss. It's a pair of Gomas. Goma is a classic enemy that I'm always happy to see return, and they look great here, though it's interesting that they change from green and black in the DX version to red in the remake. But either way, this is a nice classic look for Goma. I'm all about it. Goma is the one boss type that gets a pass from me for having a big eyeball weak point. You can fight them using the hookshot or the bow if you purchased it already by this point. Strangely, from my testing at least, the bow seems to be more effective in Link's Awakening DX, as you can deal more damage directly, while in the remake, the hookshot actually ends up being more effective, as instead of dealing damage itself, it stuns Goma, letting you get multiple hits in with your sword, and therefore dealing more damage overall. In either case, it's a good mid-boss, but I think I like the remake's version a little better, since the pairing of the hookshot and sword ends up feeling like a bit more of a strategic fight that keeps you mindful of your positioning, since you have to get close to attack while they're stunned and then quickly retreat. The final note I want to make here is about getting the boss key, which is tucked in this room, which we can reach through this underwater passageway. While I have been pretty critical of the use of these passageways, at least this one is visually distinct from the others, and therefore more memorable as a point of interest that will draw players back once they have the dungeon item. I just think it would have been more effective if it was the only one of these passageways, or if they used other landmarks for this moment. But alas, it is still quite the satisfying moment to be able to extend this bridge and finally grab that boss key. So with all of that said and done, we can hookshot across this gap and confront the dungeon boss. After a quick introduction, the boss will burst through the floor and walls, revealing itself. This is the Slime Eel, though he's not quite as slimy as, say, Slime Eye, so he's a bit of a pain if I'm being honest. The boss itself exists mostly out of bounds in the arena, with his spiky tail protruding out of the hole in the center of the floor. It'll spin around, so you've got to carefully avoid that. All the while, he'll poke his face through the holes in the walls to try and chomp at at you. What we've got to do is fire the hookshot into his mouth to yank him from the wall, revealing his neck as his weak spot. Sounds simple, but he has 4 potential positions. The window of timing to use the hookshot is also pretty short, and sometimes he even fakes you out. Maybe it's just me, but I have trouble avoiding his tail for whatever reason. I think I get too focused in on trying to stay aligned with the holes in the wall that I forget to tuck out of the way of his tail in time. That's probably just on me, let's be real. It's never so much of an issue where I end up dying, but enough of one that I leave the fight with some serious damage. Still, this is a pretty decent boss battle, one which makes very good use of the dungeon item in conjunction with your sword. I like that the hookshot pulls the boss towards you rather than just stunning him in place. That's good stuff, and makes it a little different than Goma. Plus, having to be mindful of your positioning and actually avoid the boss's attacks is a bit refreshing after the gallery of very easy bosses that we've had in Slime Eye, the Hard-Hit Beetle, and the Anglerfish, all of whom were absurdly easy. So this is a welcome change of pace in my books. After some interesting dialogue, he will perish, we'll get our heart container as usual, and of course we'll get the wind marimba, the 5th instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So overall, Catfish's Maw is a very good dungeon, which leans heavily into the big tangled knot feeling that I have praised so much in the past. Though it doesn't feel quite as polished as, say, Angler's Tunnel, it does deliver on being a satisfying dungeon to navigate with a heavy focus on dungeon item utility. The hookshot has use cases in nearly every single room, whether it be by making enemies easier to fight or by having large gaps that you need to cross, either by pulling Link across directly or by using the hookshot to extend these bridges. It is masterfully implemented here, though the over-reliance on those underground passageways does at times hold the dungeon back, and I really feel it's another case of the designers having put themselves in too much of a box by adhering to that dungeon shape. Had they abandoned the shape and made the layout less disjointed, then it might be one of the best dungeons in the game, but as it stands, there are just too many of these passageways, which muddles up the navigation. Do we really need 2 of them to lead towards the boss door? Even still, the dungeon has a strong gameplay identity, having a clear objective of hunting down the Master Stalfos, previewing nearly the entire dungeon as we do so, then being rewarded for our efforts with the hookshot, allowing us to reach everything that we couldn't before, which after all of those little teases delivers on a strong sense of satisfaction. Though I think it would have been pretty cool if the Master Stalfos battles were a little more challenging, though the Gomas do make up for that. Still, I'd rather they prioritize a mechanically sound dungeon over a tough mid-boss any day, and they absolutely deliver in that respect. The dungeon really feels like a mini Metroidvania, just with how much stuff you pass by and then later can access once you have the hookshot. So while there are a few small issues with the overall layout, this dungeon still manages to offer a great sense of exploration and player satisfaction. I like it quite a lot. Just north of Animal Village is a little path that we've actually been able to access for quite some time, but it's just before the 6th dungeon that this trek becomes mandatory. While taking this path, the owl will tell us that there are 2 nearby shrines, one to the north and one to the south. The northern one is the dungeon, but the entrance is locked. The key is of course found in the shrine to the south. which sits among the ancient ruins. You'll want to come equipped with the bow if you haven't already bought it from the shop, in order to make quick work of the many Armos slumbering here. Just a quick note here, exploring these ruins, while brief, is pretty fun, but I think this is one of those cases where the reduced visibility of the Game Boy original actually plays nicely into the design. With such a limited field of view, you often will find forks in the road with no real way of actually knowing which is the correct path until you just try one. While I'm not usually a fan of guesswork, it's mostly unintrusive, and taking a path towards a dead end will usually still gain you a glimpse towards the road ahead. It also ends up making the whole area feel much larger than it really is. This is one of those moments where the devs not only took technical limitations into account, but designed the space with those limitations in mind. While the remake's seamless scrolling is usually to the game's benefit, especially when you have such large open spaces, it actually ends up undermining the tone of this area just a little bit. When you can see so much of the path ahead, you don't have to figure out how to navigate the space here. This is one of the only times in the game where this is an issue for me personally, but I do find it interesting to see where and when that seamless scrolling gets integrated into the remake, because there are times in dungeons where they choose not to do it, where I think it would be a benefit, and then there are times like out here in the ruins where they do, despite the area clearly having been designed with a limited field of view in mind. Eventually, we'll reach the south face shrine. A change I like is that in the remake they replace these nondescript gargoyle-esque statues, which were taken right from A Link to the Past's Eastern Palace I might add, with statues of the Armos Knight, which is far more fitting since that's who we'll be fighting inside. Yep, a little pre-dungeon boss fight. If you played A Link to the Past, this guy will feel pretty familiar to you, though it's just a single one instead of 6. He will attempt to jump on you, so you've got to avoid that and then strike back, with arrows being the most effective weapon against him. This fight is pretty decent, and while not overwhelmingly so, it's nice to have such an aggressive boss, especially considering how few of them so far have been any real threat. And it's also neat that he will actually take battle damage. That's a nice touch. Once he's defeated, he'll drop the face key, so we can go unlock the dungeon. But first, there's something in the back room, a stone relief, which reads as follows. To the finder, the Isle of Koholint is but an illusion. Human, monster, sea, sky, a scene on the lid of a sleeper's eye. Awake the dreamer, and Koholint will vanish, much like a bubble on a needle. Cast away. You should know the truth. This is followed by Link's only shown line of dialogue in the game. What? Illusion. The owl outside will say nobody is really sure if this is the truth. No one except the windfish, urging us to continue on our quest. Now, I've spent a lot more time on this pre-dungeon section than usual, but there's a reason for that. Put simply, sitting with this knowledge, experiencing this revelation, will directly play into the dungeon experience, and I really feel that that is important. So we may as well get into it. With the face key in hand, we can cross through this stone maze and underground tunnel, and using the face key, we can head into the dungeon. This is the one I was most looking forward to revisiting. Welcome to the Face Shrine. Oh yeah, look at that. It's a little face. And so is he. So I wouldn't really be doing this dungeon justice if we didn't address the elephant in the room. And I don't mean these statues. I mean the music. Starting with the original Game Boy version. The song is a direct parallel to the South Face Shrine theme that we heard before the dungeon, but with a suitably different tone. The South version was slow and mysterious, a fitting piece, considering it was there that we learned the truth of Koholint Island. Of course, this theme got a fantastic update in the remake, adding this gut-punching string section. Now in the actual Face Shrine dungeon, the theme drops the slow, mysterious vibe and replaces it with a sense of dread. We know the truth, and now we have to sit with it. The track wonderfully plays with the levels, fading in and out. The best way I can describe the feeling here is like this track is the musical representation of having a pit in your stomach and having to push on anyways, even if you're not 100% sure that what you're doing is right. It's an incredible piece of dungeon music. If you ask me, the best one in the game. And that's on the Game Boy. But the remake's version is nothing short of a masterpiece. Using primarily string, an entirely new rendition of the theme takes shape, one that fully embraces that sense of questioning, of dread. And then, nearly a minute into the track, the original Game Boy version kicks in, playing unaltered. Not just elements of the theme with new instrumentation, both versions play side by side, uninterrupted for nearly a full minute. It is not hyperbole or figure of speech when I say that this dungeon theme gives me goosebumps. It is the perfect musical accompaniment to the narrative here. That feeling of having learned a terrible truth and being left to stew in it. This is the track that made me have to look up the music credits for the remake, because I needed to know who to thank. Ryo Nagamatsu is credited with music and arrangements, and holy crap, Nintendo, give this man a raise. What an incredible body of work. But bringing this back to Link's Awakening, he truly did an incredible job of taking this game's soundtrack and breathing new life into it. And Face Shrine might be his magnum opus. Thank you, Mr. Nagamatsu. Perhaps this contradicts statements that I've made in the past, but the remake's version of this theme might not just be the best dungeon music in the game, it's among the best dungeon music in the entire Zelda series. If it's not the best, it is certainly up there, putting up a good fight with the likes of the Forest Temple. As much as I could go on and on praising this track, I will always be the first to admit that music theory is a weak spot of mine. I do not know the technicalities of how these artists bring these pieces of music together. I can only tell you how it makes me feel listening to it. So sometimes you just need to bring in the experts. So please welcome Zelda Music Theory to the channel.
This is the best part of the video. No cap. The Face Shrine has a theme that perfectly suits its context within the game. Link has just learned a truth that will change his perspective irreversibly. And suddenly, we find for the first time in the game, a dungeon theme missing a certain motif. Anyone remember this? Or this? Or this? It turns out this 1, 2, 3, 7 line occurs in every single cave and dungeon theme in the game. Every theme, that is, except one. See, Link just left the Southern Face Shrine, where he learns the truth about waking the Windfish, and the shrine theme contains this quote. But the true meaning of this motif is hidden a bit deeper. We hear this theme throughout the game. and you begin to realize that the theme being quoted is actually the Ballad of the Windfish. And then you start to hear it everywhere. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. It's almost as if this theme becomes the villain of the game, the song that can annihilate the entire island population, and Link doesn't want to wake up. Wow, some of us have been sleeping on this theme. Am I right? Okay, why did I spend so much time on this? The Face Shrine is the first theme in the game where the Ballad of the Windfish motif is blatantly absent. Perhaps to make it even more obvious, they used an identical theme to the Southern Face Shrine and just removed Ballad of the Windfish, the one quote we expected to be there. It's like his subconscious won't let him believe the lie any longer. There's no going back. And to symbolize this, they integrated one theme into every component of the soundtrack, then ripped it away from the Face Shrine theme to leave us with this. It kind of takes on a Beethoven Moonlight Sonata kind of feel. You get the same chord progression, same tonization of the relative major, diminished arpeggios. That's probably the single piece that most heavily influenced the Face Shrine theme. Dancing back and forth between the 1 minor and the 6 major chord blurs the line between happy and sad. And creates this very bittersweet tone. Fun fact, Gerudo Valley uses the same chord progression. Let's switch versions. Face Shrine might be the most moving piece in the entire remake soundtrack. This arrangement takes on a very Samuel Barber Adagio for strings instrumentation. And that theme was used in the movie Platoon, which is extremely emotional. It just shows you the weight of emotion they're going for here. Platoon, not Splatoon. The music utilizes ambiguity as a tool to symbolize Link's lack of understanding about the island and the truth about the Windfish. We are frequently caught between major and minor chords, and even keys. I think Link himself isn't sure how he feels. Face Shrine is divided into 3 sections. The first 8 measures, the second 8 measures, and the final 8 measures. The piece starts off in C minor. We get 3 flats, which could be E flat major or C minor, but this B natural here, which is borrowed from C major, really pulls us back into C minor, and it keeps appearing. That raised 7 or leading tone is almost like Link just can't forget what he's just heard. It's like he wants to evolve into major, but he just can't, and it ends up looping right back into minor where he started. The second section, it starts off similarly, but this time he does successfully end in major. You'll notice now instead of B naturals, we start getting B flats. It takes a second time through for Link to forget what he's heard and keep this illusion going. Then the last 8 measures lead where we know we must go. Ending on a 5-7 flat 9 chord, we get a very dark, strong return back to the harsh reality of the truth. Ultimately, it's unavoidable. The truth is going to prevail, and Link is going to have to face the reality of waking the Windfish. He's going to have to face reality. Subscribe for more dad jokes. Back to you, Captain.
Thank you so much for joining on this video and providing your insights into this wonderful piece of music. Thank you so much, man. And for everybody watching, there's a link in the description to his channel. Please make sure to go check it out for some excellent music analysis. In terms of architecture and aesthetics, we have a far less naturalistic approach this time around. Like Key Cavern, the structure is entirely man-made. In both versions, the walls use this uncanny pink stone brick with stone floor tiles and ornate statues all over the place. It's a visually distinct and at times even pleasant looking dungeon, if not a bit eerie, though the remake puts in a lot of effort to further distinguish it from Key Cavern, adding in lots of details like these little gold flourishes as accents, as well as more distinct floor tiles. Plus, the entire place feels more dynamically lit in this version, which is to be expected. You can only do so much with the lighting in a Game Boy game, but they really use it effectively to play into that eerie atmosphere here in the remake. I think it looks great. The dungeon progression and layout alike can be broken into two sections, those being the western and eastern halves respectively, both being in some ways like their own independent tangled knots to work through, each with no discernible central room. Just like Catfish's Maw, the western side needs to be tackled first, with us having to work through it to find the map, compass, and dungeon item. Then the eastern half second, in which we need to use the item to solve puzzles, find the boss key, and figure out how to reach the boss itself. Overall, I'd say a solid dungeon experience, though perhaps to a lesser extent than Angler's Tunnel did. The Face Shrine spends a fair amount of time letting us see glimpses of other parts of the dungeon and employs the old treasure chest tease, adding to that overall sense of satisfaction as we pick away at it and figure out how to access each area. These stone elephant statues are used as a pretty simple item gate in many rooms, with the level 2 power bracelet being our dungeon item. Once we have said item, then we can pick up and throw these statues, which will allow us to open new paths and access areas we could usually see but not yet reach. While I would say that it is well implemented here, the level design is all good, I do think just having even heavier things and an upgrade of the same item we already found elsewhere is a bit less interesting as an item gate style of progression, especially after the flippers and hookshot, which both granted new forms of mobility. This item is basically just a rehash, though I will say that the sound design of these statues breaking is really weirdly satisfying in the Game Boy version. There's a real weight behind it. Speaking of the dungeon item, I think I would have preferred if they placed it a little deeper into the dungeon. It's found in this room, and on a first-time playthrough, if you're working through this first half of the dungeon, it can be a real task to find it, and that's good. The dungeon lets you cover a lot of ground and hit dead ends in this massive explorable space, which is good. The drawback is that once you know where it is really easy to grab very early on, which means that on subsequent playthroughs, the exploration part of the dungeon gets severely undermined. Or perhaps an even worse risk is that because it's so readily accessible, there's a chance you could just stumble upon it very early by accident, by way of just happening to choose the correct one of multiple branching paths. I know that to a certain extent, having knowledge of a dungeon's layout and puzzles ahead of time will make the dungeon experience easier. That's a given. But in this particular case, because of how close to the entrance it is placed, it might be just a little too much easier. Playing through Angler's Tunnel or Catfish's Maw with prior knowledge doesn't make it any less of a task to actually get those dungeon items, but the benefit of that knowledge is really felt here. But on a first-time playthrough without that prior knowledge, it can be a real challenge, though something that will help with that, at least in the original version, is this hint that the owl statue will offer once you have the stone beak. It tells you to enter the space where the eyes have walls, which is a clear reference to the map being shaped like a face. On said map, the eyes are empty spaces, but there are hidden rooms there, not unlike level 9 of the original Legend of Zelda on NES. So that's a pretty well-worded hint that will steer us towards the item, if we manage to explore far enough to find the beak and those various dead ends. However, this is something the remake sort of messes up. In most cases, I greatly prefer the more detailed maps of the remake, especially the ability to leave pins, because a lot of dungeon rooms are of uniform size, so often those added details help to make landmarks stand out better. However, The remake also fills in those eyes of the map to show the rooms there, which means the hint about the eyes having walls no longer makes sense. These sorts of hidden rooms in the original are omitted intentionally, so it was a deliberately made puzzle that played into the dungeon shape. And it was one of the few times where the dungeon shape wasn't just unintrusive, but actually was a benefit. So I'm really not sure why they chose to do this. But either way, the added details of the map and ability to leave pins to note connecting stairways and passages does somewhat offset this and make the navigation smoother overall. So it's a double-edged sword, if you ask me. The overall experience is improved, but at the cost of a neat little moment. I mean, they didn't even change or reword the statue's hint. Anyways, once we have everything collected from the western half of the dungeon, we can move on to the eastern half, which has some very interesting puzzles, such as this infinitely looping set of rooms that adds some extra surrealism to the mix, and a couple of mid-bosses. The first one is this guy, sometimes called Rover, sometimes called Smasher, depending on the source. They will lob this heavy orb at you, and you essentially have to grab it and throw it back at them to deal damage. This is one of those fights that's a little bit funny, the way he panics when you grab it. It's a decent mid-boss. We'll also re-encounter a pair of Dodongo snakes, making a return from Key Cavern, though this time in a far more varied arena with some pitfalls in the mix. Aside from these battles, the main objective of this second half is getting the boss key, which first requires a small key to access. Depending on the route you take to get it, however, it can lead to doing an extra lap through this portion of the dungeon, since the small key is down in this lower section with no way to get back up to the balcony if you jumped down from there, aside from backtracking to the start of the loop. It's not an extremely long trip, but it can be a nuisance to retread all of this ground immediately after having just done it. Something I've neglected to mention as well is the way the dungeon makes use of the red and blue gem switches and barriers, which the game first introduced to us way back in Bottle Grotto. I love these things, and Face Shrine makes a very good use of them, having certain paths or even just portions of some rooms blocked off by them, and even using them to jump on at one point to reach these stairs. There's 6 of these gem switches to toggle the barriers spread out throughout the dungeon, and in some cases the act of activating them needs to be delayed so that you can pass by the barrier first. So they managed to use this as both an obstacle for individual rooms as well as part of a larger multi-room puzzle for navigating the dungeon as a larger whole. Now that's some clever design. Though something I'm a little less enthusiastic about is the dungeon's use of underground passageways, just as was the case in Catfish's Maw. This time there's only 3 of them. 2 of them are essentially extensions of the same route, and the first one, which leads towards the dungeon item, is a simple loop in the path that pretty well never has to be revisited once you've gone through it to get said item, much like the path towards the boss key in Angler's Tunnel. So it doesn't feel as bad to me here as in Catfish's Maw. It's a little less disjointed, but it does still have the effect of muddying up the navigation in a way that I'm not fond of. Of course, the remake's ability to add pins to the map helps in a big way, but in the original, you're pretty well going to have to commit this stuff to memory, or take notes while you go. If dungeon navigation isn't your strong suit, then I can see having to make this trip for the boss key and then having to take a second trip towards the boss door itself being quite the endeavor. I'll clarify. This is only a small amount of time spent in the dungeon going through here. So while the use of these passageways doesn't really do it for me, the other 90% of the time spent navigating this dungeon is really great. There's plenty of explorable space, forks in the road with obstacles and mechanisms to work with, all good stuff. So with all of that said and done, once we've smashed open this chest and gotten the boss key, which is a puzzle that is a little too obvious, we can trek through this passageway and confront the dungeon boss. Entering the room, the boss will appear within the floor itself, taunting us. This is Facade. And yes, he is a weird disembodied face. But hey, we're leaning more and more into surrealism here. And this is when I'd like to shine a light on something which I haven't really addressed yet, outside of some transitional edits. While I ubiquitously use terms like boss key and dungeon boss, as is usually the term in the Zelda series, that isn't what Link's Awakening, the game itself, actually calls these guys. He isn't just the dungeon boss, he is a nightmare, and not in the figurative or metaphorical sense. Recall what we've learned, what knowledge we've been sitting with as we made our way through this dungeon, that the island itself is a dream. So fittingly, the monsters that we are battling within are nightmares. And so leaning into the surrealism here doesn't just make sense, it adds to the danger of it all. This is one of those cases in which the narrative and gameplay go hand in hand. Facade attacks you by flinging floor tiles and pots at you, and making random pitfalls appear in the floor below you, phasing in and out of existence as he does. Though in the original, he only seems to appear in the center of the room, while in the remake, he actually moves around a fair bit. In order to deal damage, you need to explode his face with bombs, and that's it. That said, this is one of those cases where there isn't much to indicate his weakness. He'll even quip about that. So it's a matter of just trying things out to see what attacks work. Once you know, though, he isn't too tough to take down. His appearance either way is neat, but I do think that overall I prefer the more dynamic battle of the remake, just for that extra spatial awareness and timing required with your bombs. And once he's defeated, he'll confirm the worst for us. Before perishing, he'll interject. If the windfish wakes up, everything on this island will be gone forever. And I do mean everything. Herein lies the quandary. Are these nightmares evil? Are we doing the right thing by killing them? They do not seem to be attempting world domination. The owl at the beginning of the game mentions that they only began to act hostile in direct response to Link's presence. At the very notion that someone might wake the windfish, these nightmares are fighting to survive. This dialogue is a plea. It's not just them that will cease to be. It is everything. Everyone. Surely Link could let the windfish sleep, right? Koholint isn't so bad of a place for Link to retire, right? Are we doing the right thing? To quote my friend Nehru, it's tough to feel good about killing a boss who tells you that they don't want to die. But we have to awaken the windfish, or we'll never be able to leave the island. But if we continue on this trajectory, we are dooming not just these nightmares, but even our friends. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the coral triangle, the sixth instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So overall, from a strictly level design standpoint, Face Shrine is a pretty good, but not mind-blowingly amazing dungeon on its own. There's a few more notes I have though. These little knight chess piece puzzles are kind of neat, and again one of those things that I think is enhanced in the remake, while still using the same core concept. In the original, you just have to figure out which direction to throw them so that they'll land upright. But in the remake, they instead have designated tiles to be thrown onto, and they move like a knight in chess, so you have to line yourself up accordingly. That's neat. The remake does remove or trim a few redundancies and tedious moments. For example, in the original, the Dodongo snakes will actually respawn if you stray too far, so I ended up having to fight them twice, since I had to take a second lap through this path. In the remake, they'll stay dead. There's also a room in which the doors will lock and you'll be attacked by these spinning floor tiles. In the original, the doors will lock every time, meaning you'll have to just sit through and wait it out if you end up wandering into this room more than once. While in the remake, the floor tiles will respawn, but the doors will not re-lock after the first time, so you can just run through here on subsequent visits. But not everything the remake does is an improvement. The eye room puzzle I mentioned earlier, which the owl statue hints at, makes no sense with the map's extra details filling in those rooms. And that's really too bad because it undermines what was a cool little aha moment. Still, with enough exploration, you should be able to still figure out the dungeon. I just wish they'd either left those rooms blank on the map or changed the phrasing of the hint to actually make sense, sort of like they did in the Colour dungeon with these rotating switch puzzles. Though an extremely minor point, I think the looping room puzzle hits a little better in the original version as well. The actual loops are a little more seamless for some reason, while in the remake they add a fade to black at the point where the rooms loop. It is extremely minor, but I think it undercuts the surreal vibe of it. Like, imagine if the infinite stairs in Mario 64 for some reason had this random fade to black at the top instead of this memorable moment where it goes on seemingly forever. Also, there's this one stairway that takes you outside the dungeon briefly for a secret. I just always think it's neat when we get to pop outside the dungeon somewhere for a little moment. I didn't really know where else to include it in the script. It's not a huge moment, but I just think it's neat. All of that said, while the level design itself would leave Face Shrine as simply a very good but not excellent dungeon, the experience overall is greatly enhanced by the music and narrative. I remember the first time I played this dungeon, I swear I had that sinking feeling the entire time just from the context of this dungeon and where it is placed during the game's story. I think it's brilliant that they give you this revelation before the dungeon and just let you stew in it. As strange as it sounds, playing through this place with that pit in my stomach is kind of unforgettable. The remake really bolsters this in many ways by leaning into that eerie, surreal atmosphere, and most notably by hitting us with that music. What a masterpiece. So combining the good level design with the context that this dungeon sits in the center of, and assigning it one of the most brilliant pieces of music in the series, and you end up elevating this from just a very good dungeon to an exceptional one.
This one I had a hard time finding, except for through SoundCloud. So let's see if that's on YouTube.
I've got this dream, and you're all in it.
Let's hear it.
Oh, that's fitting for Link's Awakening. Oh my gosh. I've got this dream and you're all in it. Oh my goodness. I almost didn't catch that. Okay, that's creepy.
At the northeastern peak of the Telltale mountain range sits the Eagle's Tower. However, we'll need to find the bird key to gain entry into the dungeon. To do so, we'll need to revive the legendary rooster, meaning we'll first need to learn the frog's Song of Soul. Now that we have the level 2 power bracelet, we can push aside the weather vane in Mabe Village to find the resting place of the rooster, resurrect him, and bring him up the mountains with us. Oh, he made a full recovery? A recovery from being dead? Okay, great. He'll help us fly across these chasms within the mountain cave systems where we can find the bird key. So, in summary, we'll need to learn a song from a frog to revive a bird friend to get the bird key to unlock the bird dungeon. Simple, right? Jokes aside, I do quite like this dungeon lead up. We can actually access this cave ahead of time and catch a glimpse of the key, but otherwise the game allows us to explore and figure out for ourselves where the key is and how we can get it. I like the hands-off approach personally, but maybe that's because it plays into my rather methodical playstyle. We can learn the Frog Song of Soul from Mamu long before this point, for example, so so as long as you're thorough, you should be able to figure this out. The only part that I can see being a little too cryptic is knowing that you can push the weather vane aside, but I've always felt like it's made to be enough of a memorable landmark for players personally, since Marin spends a great deal of the game hanging out in front of it, and this guy gives us a hint about it.
Luigi.
Plus, the remake adds this little sign here to draw a further connection between that hint about the rooster flying and this place. But yeah, I can see this being a little on the cryptic side. Anyways, with all of that said, once we have the bird key, we can unlock the Eagle's Tower. So with the entrance revealed, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to Eagle's Tower, what is often seen as a very divisive dungeon. Many people don't like this one, citing the confusing layout and overall difficult puzzle box nature as the reason. However, and this may come as no surprise to those keeping up with the series, I love this place. Visually, the dungeon looks great, with a distinct gray-green and blue color palette. It has a colder, less welcoming visual identity than any other dungeon up to this point, though in the Game Boy version, we have the same wall texture that several other dungeons have used already, while the remake gives us a fresh, new stone brick wall texture, which looks fantastic and visually aligns the dungeon interior with its exterior. I can't explain exactly what it is, but in both versions, these blue floor tiles in particular are just super eye-catching and visually appealing as a way to break up the monotony of the usual floor design, as well as draw your attention to certain points of interest. The dungeon music is likewise great. It has this dark, dare I say, spooky vibe, with the levels fading in and out, much as was the case with Face Shrine. But rather than a feeling of questioning and dread, the music here evokes a haunting, dreamlike feeling, like the knowledge Link has that terrible truth is following him through here. It's fantastic and a suitably dark piece of dungeon music. The remake retains this feeling, but naturally swaps out the chiptunes for two types of piano. The main part of this song is done on a standard piano with modulated echoing levels. Then this section kicks in using the same toy piano sound that we heard back in Mabe Village's theme. A dark twist on something familiar? Or is it a familiar twist on something dark? It is interesting to see the progression that these dungeon themes have gone through in tandem with the narrative. Catfish's maw felt dangerous. It was the full extent to how far the lie could be stretched, and it matched that intensity. Between dungeons, we had the twist reveal, and Face Shrine made you stew in it. It let you sit there and question reality, be in denial for a little bit before facing the truth. But now there's no going back. And even though we know the truth, we have to press on, with that knowledge reverberating in the back of our minds, haunting us. While it doesn't quite match how good the Face Shrine theme is, very few tracks will, it is honestly still a great piece of dungeon music. It's just so otherworldly and eerie. As for progressing through the dungeon itself, the tower has a primary objective of using an iron ball to destroy 4 supporting pillars spread out throughout the 2nd floor, which will cause the 4th floor to collapse down into the 3rd. However, doing so isn't as straightforward as it sounds. There are various barriers, gaps, and blocks in the way to make navigation more complex. I love it. The dungeon truly challenges you to learn the layout and engage with its mechanics. You'll often be able to see other parts of rooms that you can't reach and have to throw the iron ball over to, then plot a course and figure out how to get there yourself in order to make progress. The 4 pillars are placed equidistant from each other in the core of floor 2. The eastern 2 are fairly simple to get, since they're placed very close to where we initially find the iron ball, making them a logical starting point. Meanwhile, the western 2 are far more of a task. This one in the northwest requires you to throw the orb over the barrier and then make a trip around the entire outer perimeter of the floor to reach that spot. Meanwhile, the final one in the southwest is placed in a room that you can catch a glimpse of and see that there are bombable walls through this corridor, but you have to make sure first that you've completed this puzzle to make a chest appear so that you can hookshot across the gap. And you've also got to make sure that you've tossed the orb across here first before heading north, bombing the walls so that you can cross through this passageway and break the pillar. I adore multi-step puzzles like this one. Furthermore, Eagle's Tower makes fantastic use of its vertical space, especially for a 2D game, with not just stairways used to connect floors, but also holes in the floor that we can drop down to the corresponding rooms below. And it all makes physical sense in terms of how these rooms are positioned and where you'll end up. And look, there's no underground passageways. Thank you. I know that this dungeon is a real struggle for many, but something about it has always just clicked with me, and I think that aspect of the layout plays a key part in it. The navigation is complicated by design, yes, but it also does make sense if you think about the tower as a physical, largely vertical space, especially with it having no random passageways that will just pop you out wherever, regardless of if it makes sense or not. It just works. The dungeon also heavily incorporates the red and blue gem switches and barriers, adding a further wrinkle into the navigation, as certain paths will be blocked off and inaccessible depending on the orientation of those barriers, with the gem switches being deliberately placed in a handful of key locations, allowing you to toggle the colors, which swaps which barriers are raised and lowered. I can't help but admire how well they placed these switches. This one on floor 1 is in a pretty good spot, and toggling the switch is going to impact which parts of the entire floor are accessible, including which staircases you can access to get back up to floor 2. But they do deliberately put a few spaces here to allow you to jump on top of the barriers before toggling it if you need to. That's clever. Meanwhile, upstairs on floor 2, there are 2 more switches. This one right near the item chest stands out a little less and doesn't have quite as many use cases, but the placement of this switch at the south end of floor 2 is a masterful stroke of design, despite only being 2 screens away from the other one. This is a critical room in the dungeon, despite how innocuous it seems. It's right near both the stairway up towards floor 3 as well as the first stairway from floor 1, and since it can be reached and triggered from 3 different directions in conjunction with the close proximity to the 4 central pillars and how it directly impacts your access to the floor above, it means you're going to be making a pass through this room several times, likely needing to toggle those barriers as you do. It's a small detail, but a critical one when when looking at how the progression is handled here. I mentioned this way back when we looked at Bottle Grotto, but a key difference between versions here is that the remake color codes the barriers and switches. In DX, the barriers are all red, while in the remake they changed them to be half red and half blue, which aligns them with how they appeared in A Link to the Past. This sounds pretty minor, and I wouldn't blame you for writing this off as an aesthetic nicety, but I really do feel that the color coding of these barriers makes the puzzle navigation aspect just a little easier to wrap one's brain around. If you can tell which color needs to be raised or lowered, and are able to make a mental note of that, head over to the Switch, alter it as needed, and then navigate back. It ties it all together a little more nicely. It's a small but welcome change. A final point to note about the bottom two floors is that we'll find the dungeon item here, tucked in a treasure chest that we'll see before we can reach. In the chest, we'll find the mirror shield, and it is my favorite version of the iconic item. A Link to the Past's version simply blocked stronger attacks than before. The 3D versions, meanwhile, mostly got used for light reflecting puzzles. But in Link's Awakening, the mirror shield actually reflects enemy attacks back at them, including spears that moblins throw and even Beamos lasers. This is even more satisfying in the remake, where the Beamos can be petrified, making short work of what is usually an invincible and a very threatening enemy. What a great sense of player progression. As for the dungeon's top two floors, there's a little less to note up here since the bulk of the navigation is likely to happen between floors 1 and 2. There's a final gem switch up here on floor 3, which has far more limited use compared to the one down in floor 2. And there is the dungeon's mid-boss, a fella named Grim Creeper. I unfortunately don't have too much to say about this guy. He'll summon these little guys, which are apparently called battle bats, and you've got to make sure to kill them all in one wave. Otherwise, they'll respawn infinitely. In either version, the fight is extremely easy, so long as you position yourself strategically and can mash your sword button quickly enough. Otherwise, once we've wiped out all of his little minions, he will flee and we'll get the Nightmare Key. From here, if you've already dropped the 4th floor down into the 3rd, then you can pretty well go ahead and finish the dungeon. If not, then you'll have to backtrack downstairs and finish up there first. But either way, once we have dropped floor 4 down and gotten the Nightmare Key, we can unlock this door and confront the dungeon boss. Rather than a room inside, we'll find ourselves climbing a ladder to the roof of the tower exterior. It's here that we'll see the Grim Creeper again, who mounts this giant bird, initiating the boss fight. This is the Evil Eagle, and like the mid-boss shortly before, he's not exactly going to give you a run for your money. Like Moldorm, this is more about staying in the fight rather than anything else, as he'll do various swoops and aerial attacks, including a wind gust that can knock you down to the platform below. If you do end up falling down, the fight will reset and his health will regenerate. They attempted to make this a little more difficult in the remake by including spikes on the bottom platform, but even then, I don't think this was quite enough to add that element of challenge to the fight. While the gameplay side of things is a little bit lackluster, the fact that the Grim Creeper is the one riding the Evil Eagle does make for a sort of rivalry with them. It's just too bad that in both encounters, they're absolute pushovers. You can fight the eagle with either your sword if you're willing to be patient and wait for them to get close, or with any of the long-distance weapons at your disposal, such as the boomerang. And so long as you're able to withstand the wind and stay in the ring, the Evil Eagle should go down, with dialogue that casts further doubt into the nature of our quest, of course. You will be lost too if the windfish wave Yikes. Same as me, you are in his dream. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and back downstairs we'll find the Organ of Evening Calm, the 7th instrument of the siren needed to awaken the Windfish. So overall, boss fight aside, Eagle's Tower is a well-designed dungeon that offers just the right amount of challenge for being this late into the game. Many people don't, but I'm a maniac and I love it. The dungeon has a well-conveyed, overarching objective that allows you to make a physical change to the dungeon itself, with these pillars needing to be broken. It incorporates vertical space into its navigation, ties in the gem switches and barriers, and combines all of these concepts into one neatly designed puzzle box dungeon. Any one of these core concepts would be great on their own, but cleverly integrating all of these ideas into one dungeon is just brilliant. A few more notes I have though. Power scaling is always a difficult thing to capture, but you can really feel how much more powerful Link is at this point in the game when you encounter this Hinox, who is technically the strongest version of a Hinox we've encountered to date, but can be destroyed in mere seconds. The enemy variety is pretty good in this dungeon too, even though puzzles and navigation are the main focus over combat here. I am a big fan of these treasure chests that are up on these ledges around the first floor as well, even though only one of them is mandatory, containing a small key, while the other has a secret shell. But it is still neat to play into that verticality that way by requiring us to find the right spot above to jump down to. In a way, the tower is essentially a microcosm, a miniature bit of foreshadowing for the game itself. We'll wreak havoc and destroy an entire part of the dungeon in order to finish it and leave, which mirrors the end of the game, and the dungeon item is a mirror shield. Though this is on a much smaller scale compared to what's to come. It's not the entire place, just 4 pillars to collapse a single floor. Still, knowing how the game ends makes this a bit unnerving to think about. Link is truly a destructive force in this game. Mechanically speaking, while we've seen a lot of instances of these switches and barriers being incorporated into Zelda dungeons, between all of these dungeons in either A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening, this is definitely the most fully realized take on this mechanic, spanning navigation across multiple floors, which requires quite a lot of crisscrossing to get through. It's great. My only real gripe with the dungeon as a whole is that there are some areas that don't quite feel like they were put to use as well as they could have been. For example, these rooms on floor 3 feel a little underdeveloped. Pretty well this entire western portion of this floor can be either ignored or entirely circumvented, which is too bad because it presents as if there would be a bit of a navigation puzzle to get through here, but it doesn't really go anywhere with that. If you haven't dropped floor 4 down yet, then it's literally a dead end. And if you have, then you can reach that area by just grabbing the boss key instead and passing through the boss door in the adjacent room, which this connects back on. It feels like something should be there, especially given that there are a fair amount of enemies and a key block, but there just isn't. It might have been worth moving the key block to before the mid-boss instead, and hiding the corresponding small key there, just to make it worthwhile to actually cover this ground. Likewise, I also think that the middle section of floor 1 is a little underutilized. You'll probably have to pass through here once or twice, but it feels more like the area is a red herring, something that looks like a wrinkle in the navigation, but is really there to just throw you off. While my first playthrough of the dungeon doesn't quite stick out in my memory, I can only imagine how much of a headache this area could potentially give to first-time players, only for them to realize that there isn't really much of anything of value here. On repeat playthroughs, if you really know what you're doing, doing, then the entire area can be navigated around by sticking to the surrounding rooms instead, and dropping down around from the floor above. So while minor, it does feel like something of a missed opportunity to not put anything there. Maybe the chest with the compass should have been placed up on this little ledge here, or something. And this is just a teensy tiny little note, but if it were up to me, I would have moved this small key from where it's found here, right beside the corresponding locked door, to this very southwestern room here, just to make slightly better use of this space and the fork in the road that the dungeon initially presents us with. It would make for a very short detour, but I guess I'm just never that big on keys being dropped right in front of a locked door like this. Aside from all of that, however, what we did get with Eagle's Tower is still nothing short of excellent in terms of level design. Of course I'm going to find nitpicks with it while I'm here looking for them, but I promise that even with all of these, it still manages to be among my favorite 2D Zelda dungeons. It is in many ways well crafted, with a fair blend of both linear design as well as non-linear design. Since some events like breaking these pillars, getting the mirror shield, or even finding the boss key are able to be done in a variety of sequences. There's elbow room, while still feeling deliberately curated, all the while having several core puzzle navigation mechanics integrated masterfully. Besides, there's just something novel about a dungeon, especially one in a Game Boy game, having such a dynamic element like this one, allowing you to change a core physical part of the dungeon layout itself. That's some good level design. We're approaching the end game now. But before we wrap things up with Link's Awakening, we have one final dungeon to get to, Turtle Rock, which sits on the western peak of the Tal Tal mountain range. Unlike the last handful of dungeons, there's not a ton of prerequisites before this one. It's pretty well a straight shot west towards there, with our journey being only briefly interrupted by this moment with Marin, who seems to know more here than she's letting on, having apparently attempted to wake the Windfish herself by singing in front of the giant egg at Mount Tamranch. If you explored the mountains thoroughly before this point, then you may have come across this cave which was previously impassable without getting a little scorched. But since we now have the mirror shield from Eagle's Tower, we can block these flames and make our way through here safely. Another example of that item gating progression style that I've talked about so much already when examining previous dungeon lead-up sections. Eventually, we'll find ourselves in front of Turtle Rock itself, but before we can head inside, we will need to once more use the Frog's Song of Soul to awaken Turtle Rock, apparently. Yep. We get a little pre-dungeon boss fight here. Always a treat. In the DX version, he's unfortunately very easy to kill. You just gotta spam your sword at him. The Switch remake, meanwhile, expands upon the fight by having him not shed his rock shell initially, adding an extra phase to the battle at the start, where we need to use bombs to break said shell apart before we can attack him directly with our sword. Even then, he moves much more dynamically, avoiding your attacks, though he'll occasionally do this charge attack, which can be exploited as it causes him to hit the walls, stunning himself, and giving you an opening to attack. All of this extra mobility gives the fight a fair amount more substance. I definitely think it's an improvement over the original, even if it's still a bit on the easy side. But in either version, it's a nice treat to have a little boss encounter like this before the dungeon. And for those of us who played A Link to the Past, which has its own version of Turtle Rock, this is a pleasant little surprise to see a familiar landmark with a little twist. If you're not sure how a dungeon entrance can make sense as a boss fight, I'll remind you that we're past the point in the game where we're grounded in what can or can't make logical sense, and leaning into dreamscape surrealism instead. So for me, it works. With all of that said, once he's defeated, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Turtle Rock, home of the final instrument of the siren, and as you'd expect, it is the game's most expansive and sprawling dungeon. Seriously, this place is huge, and shaped like a turtle, as you'd expect. Though it is another instance of the dungeon layout being a neat detail that doesn't end up detracting from the experience. Turtle Rock, being within a mountain, somewhat fills the role of a fire-themed dungeon with a volcanic, rocky interior. Aesthetically, especially for a Game Boy title, they pulled this off pretty well, with a flowy pattern on the wall textures that evokes volcanic, igneous rocks that have melted and then solidified to shape the walls. The whole look of these side-scrolling passageways is especially impressive, with a haze above the lava pools and stalactites hanging in the background. The sprite artists really went all out in these areas, and the colors used to distinguish the hot and cold ones are quite effective at making those critical cold passageways stand out as memorable landmarks. Ones that you could possibly encounter pretty early on, but will need to keep in mind and revisit much later in the dungeon after getting the dungeon item. The whole volcanic vibe here is really well leaned into in the Switch remake as well, even though they forego having a new wall texture in favor of palette swapping this same old rock wall again, which is too bad. I would have liked to have seen something at least akin to that volcanic igneous rock of the original, kinda like what we get around Death Mountain in Breath of the Wild, but alas. But almost everything else here is really on point, including the new floor tile set and the added lighting effects paired with a haze and ember effect, which goes a long way in selling the sweltering atmosphere. Though I do think I prefer the vast cavernous illusion of these passageways that the original does over the rather generic by comparison stone walls that the remake uses. Maybe it's just me, but otherwise I think the remake pretty well nails it as usual. The music of Turtle Rock is surprisingly subdued, especially after the previous handful of dungeon themes. But if I may attempt to read into it, that may be to represent Link's resolve here. The previous dungeon themes have very well been in line with the story so far, with a revelation that shakes Link, questioning and dread to follow, then being haunted by that truth. But now, Link has already made up his mind. If you made it to Turtle Rock, that means that despite knowing the truth, you have decided to finish the quest. This feeling is supported by the fact that in the remake, the Telltale Mountain Range music also gets remixed after completing Eagle's Tower, replacing the theme's typical swashbuckling feeling with a new sense of resolve. That resolve carries over here into Turtle Rock, keeping in mind that Link's Awakening follows Link's adventure from A Link to the Past, and potentially even the Oracle games, depending on which version of the timeline you subscribe to, then it totally makes sense. Link is extremely experienced at dungeon crawling by this point. Counting all of the dungeons in all of those games, this is at least his 20th, but more likely his 42nd dungeon. So from that standpoint, it makes sense that the music for this place would keep an undertone of danger, but feel rather methodical. The repeating notes here also bring to mind for me this section of the original dungeon theme from the very first Legend of Zelda, which itself got a remix already in this game's Color Dungeon. But yeah, the long story short is that this theme, while not as bombastic as some of the other dungeon themes, is a good track. The remake's version of the song, as usual, updates the track in a mostly faithful way, but adds more layers and diverse instrumentation, which get layered on top of each other, fading in and out, and being distorted. All the while, those repeating notes carry on and on. The Game Boy chiptunes of the original are entirely replaced, and a new layer of choir vocals was added. It sounds great, honestly, keeping that methodical dungeon crawling feel intact. Something about those vocals just feels so Fire Dungeon to me. I can't quite place my finger on why, but I like the vibe here, honestly, and for a dungeon as massive and winding as this one, with a stronger navigation focus, a more subdued track like this is a good fit. It's not one I'll be humming to myself anytime soon, but it remains atmospheric and won't ever get irritating. The dungeon itself bases its progression mostly around being a navigational focused challenge, having that big tangled knot feeling with lots of underground passageways, just like Catfish's Maw and Face Shrine did, though even more of them this time, with a total of 6. Oh boy. That's my real only complaint with the dungeon, honestly. There's too many of these, but we'll come back to that. Aside from the way these passageways make the layout at times feel disjointed, the rest of the dungeon overall is a big interconnected maze. There's a lot of forks in the road, multiple routes you can take, which all branch off from this central room and wind around this hidden section of rooms just north of that, often looping or converging back in on each other. Frankly, I like this kind of structure. You can spend a huge amount of time just exploring here, wandering in any given direction, and initially, you'll almost always feel like you're making some amount of progress, whether it be finding small keys, the stone beak, the map, or compass. The valuable goodies are spread in every direction. There's always some place to go and something of value to find, no matter which path you take, barring a few locked doors which will redirect you to keep you exploring. As mentioned already, these paths tend to loop back on each other, giving that exploration a streamlined feeling that encourages you to really get well acquainted with the dungeon layout. I love that sort of thing. You could sum up the overall objective as initially being a key hunt, much like Key Cavern did, with multiple small keys being needed to get through this interior section of rooms, which takes us to this staircase, and ultimately towards the dungeon item. But the sequence of how and when you find all of those keys has a lot of elbow room, though an added cracked wall in the remake does end up undercutting some of the cryptic navigation of the original. Not to say the original has no cracked walls, it does, just not this one. The remake adds these cracks, and it makes finding your way into this inner section of the dungeon much easier, because your natural curiosity will likely lead you to bomb this particular wall immediately. If I see a door ahead and a bombable wall to the side, I'm going to check the bombable wall first, because it's more likely to be a secret. That said, the floor tiles in the original form a giant arrow pointing to that same spot, so it's not like it was really too hard to intuit. Still, I like the idea of these rooms being shown on the map, and having to poke around to find a way in. Thankfully, other hidden bombable walls did not have these cracks added, and there are some secret shortcuts you can take if you either know or can figure out which walls to bomb, rewarding experienced players or even just those who are thorough and willing to experiment a bit, offering another way into these interior rooms, one that bypasses this locked block in the room east of here, saving you a small key. That sort of thing is always cool to me. Seriously though, I love how this dungeon delicately balances feeling sprawling and open with having claustrophobic, tight, winding rooms. There are so many times that the paths split off, wind back on themselves in a loop, and then drop you through one-way paths, whether those be this rotating one-way door, push blocks that respawn, or ledges that you jump down from. Just navigating the dungeon is at its core the larger puzzle here, and I mean that in the best way. All of that said, this place isn't without its own individual room puzzles and challenges as well. These include these push rock puzzles, which pave a fresh layer of flooring over top of these chasms in real time. A pretty charming concept if you ask me. The first instance in which you'll probably encounter them is actually the central room, where it's really just used to create yourself a bridge over the lava in here, but the mechanic then gets put to use in a few other rooms in a more puzzle-centric way. These are somewhat similar to a Euler's Path puzzle, requiring you to fill in each tile precisely once in a single movement, meaning you'll have to be mindful of how you control this mechanism without overlapping at all, lest you end up having to reset the room. I swear this is easier to understand by doing than it is to explain. These are puzzles that I generally enjoy. However, I found the controls for this mechanism to be weirdly finicky in the DX version, causing me to spend a pretty excessive amount of time on these puzzles alone. The Switch remake fixes this, making the controls just overall smoother, more responsive, and thus easier to get this dang thing to move the way you want it to, which of course just makes for a more fun experience. But of course, even with the smoother controls, you still have to plot out the path in your mind. So the challenge lies in the puzzle itself, rather than just battling with the controls, as it should be. But still, this is a neat concept, one I don't think has ever returned in another Zelda game, at least not in this form. Moving on. A mechanic that I love, the gem switches and colored barriers, returns here, but is only used for a single obstacle. The switch is in a hidden room near the east end of the central room, and the corresponding barrier to toggle blocks the way to the dungeon item. You need to ensure you've toggled the switch one time, otherwise there will be a lot of backtracking to do. At the very least, it isn't too hard to access the switch itself from a few directions, if you know where to go, and the mid-boss right before this point will leave a portal back to the dungeon entrance as usual. So it isn't anything egregious, but it can be an annoyance if you missed the switch, or if you're like me and ended up overthinking things and chose not to activate the switch when you first found it for some reason because you were worried about accidentally blocking off a puzzle rather than unblocking it like you were supposed to, even though you've played this game dozens of times and should know better. But that's a me problem. As mentioned already, I love this mechanic, and its potential was pretty fully realized in the previous two dungeons already, so I'm not all that upset that they didn't lean into it more here. Otherwise, I think people would get pretty tired of it. But I also do think they could have found at least one more use for it somewhere in the dungeon, but I digress. The enemy variety is once again pretty solid. Despite being the final dungeon, they still managed to introduce a new enemy here in the form of the Vire. Well, I say new, but I really mean new to this game. They were in Zelda 1. Defeating the Vire ends up more or less being the dungeon's first puzzle, in fact, as it's the trigger for these two side doors to unlock at the dungeon's first fork in the road. He'll also show up a few more times throughout the dungeon to just generally harass you, but of course he's a tricky and often evasive little bugger. The dungeon also includes several mid-bosses, both returning and new. Among the returning ones are some who are fought in the same way as before, but are now much easier to defeat due to Link's increased firepower by this point in the game, including another Hinox, the Spike Roller, and Rover. These guys can be absolutely annihilated. Some others, meanwhile, get new twists added to them, such as the Hydrasaur, who is fought on more narrow ground around a pool of lava this time, and the Dodongo snakes, who you have to fight by throwing bombs at from this balcony, which, figuring that out, is also kind of a mini puzzle in and of itself. There's another new mid-boss as well, called Blano. He's this little punchy dude who made the mistake of bringing boxing gloves to a sword fight. He's pretty fun to fight. You have to really read his body language and time your attacks properly. I like that. But once you get a feel for it, you can similarly make short work of him, spin attacks being particularly effective. I mentioned this when talking about Eagle's Tower, but Link really feels like a destructive force of nature by this point of the game, and that is most apparent with these mid-bosses. It feels like the nightmares are getting desperate and throwing everything they can at Link, but he just shreds them all with ease. It's downright vicious. After defeating Blano, assuming you've toggled that aforementioned gem switch, we'll find the dungeon item. It's the magic rod, which can light stuff on fire, similar to one of the magic powder's effects, but now from a distance. Its use in combat is actually pretty good. Most enemies can be dispatched pretty easily with it, and it isn't tied to any sort of magic meter or other limitation. But in terms of its utility in the dungeon, it gets a few item gate style use cases. It's required for this torch lighting puzzle to get a small key, which will in turn unlock the path to the boss key. And 2 of the 6 passageways are also blocked off by these ice cubes, requiring the magic rod to melt and clear a path for yourself. So as far as item integration goes, it's all good in my books. And those 2 passageways take us to the boss key and dungeon boss itself. So of course, that's what we have left to tackle. With our newly acquired magic rod in hand, we can melt these ice blocks and confront the dungeon boss. Rising from the lava is Hothead. Yeah, the name is pretty on the nose, huh? Oh, you won't let me play the instruments of the siren? Sure, buddy, sure. Okay, let's rewind for a second. So, visually speaking, Hothead, while cartoonish perhaps, has a pretty unique design. He's as fire dungeon boss as it gets, no fault there. And halfway through the battle, he'll shed his outer layer to reveal a creepier, toothier form beneath, like some kind of flaming demonic nesting doll. As far as the dungeon boss's leaning into surrealism goes, I like this one, and I think it works better for me than just a giant fish or a giant bird. Unfortunately, and I hate to sound like a broken record here with my boss fight criticisms, but he simply is not a challenge at all. In both phases of the battle, you simply spam the magic rod at him and win. Easy peasy. He doesn't even change attack patterns between these 2 phases. It's purely a cosmetic change. The remake attempts to add some extra challenge here once again by removing some of the flooring and increasing the splash radius of his attacks, as well as having these magma puddles linger on the ground longer. I see what they're doing, but I just don't think it's enough. By this point in the game, he just isn't strong enough to be a real threat to you. And since the magic rod can be used without limit, you don't even have to really worry about being deliberate with your aim. You can just spam forward with it, and since he moves in a pattern horizontally across the room, you are bound to hit him if you're spammy enough. And it's too bad that nothing outside of his appearance changes during that second phase of the fight either. Really, this is one of my biggest complaints with the game overall. Very few bosses actually pose a real challenge. That is made up for when looking at everything else this game gets so right, so I can overlook it when I'm playing the game, but critically speaking, it is still worth mentioning. Anyways, before perishing, he'll offer up one more desperate plea of dialogue. Why did you come here? If it weren't for you, nothing would have to change. You cannot wake the windfish. Remember, you too are in the dream. This somewhat echoes what the boss said to us in the last dungeon, and it always has me wondering, is this an attempt at deception, or do the nightmares not truly understand who or what Link is? Curious. But either way, it's too late for him. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the Thunder Drum. the final instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So overall, Turtle Rock is a good fair challenge, and fittingly the most sprawling and navigationally challenging dungeon in the game. I like it a lot. But it is so overly reliant on those underground passageways to an annoying degree, especially since the layout isn't disjointed or narrow like Bottle Grotto, so it feels unnecessary in most instances to even have these. This is alleviated in the remake by the ability to mark pins on the map, as I've mentioned during other dungeons already, but it irks me a bit still. Why are there so many of them here? Did we really need 6? But at least the places where we end up after crossing through these passageways, more often than not, tend to still be accessible by other means of exploration, which makes it feel at least a little bit less disjointed than, say, Catfish is modded. Mostly. Not always. While the dungeon contains an excellent blend of combat and puzzles, I can't help but feel the owl statues end up spoiling the challenge of some of these puzzles by giving away too much info. For example, this puzzle where we shoot the statue's eye with an arrow, or the hint about defeating the Dodongo snakes. I don't think I'd mind this one if it wasn't right next to the statue. If they moved it to even just a few rooms away, then it might not feel so much like the developers are talking down to me, like I'm so stupid that I can't figure this out. Typically, Zelda games are so good at making you feel smart for figuring stuff out, but when they spell it out for you this heavily, it undermines that feeling. I'd also like to mention that the Switch version removes some minor annoyances that can make this dungeon more tedious feeling. For example, in DX, some mid-bosses will respawn, and while they can usually be killed pretty quickly, it's still an unnecessary nuisance to deal with. Especially Rover, who can't be mashed out of existence with your sword, like, say, this Hinox can. Additionally, doors that lock upon entry in the original will relock if you revisit those rooms, but remain open after that first time you unlock them in the remake. And of course, small things like the pop-up text when you so much as accidentally graze one of these ice blocks in the original are relegated to an optional examine text, thank goodness, which applies to other item-specific obstacles around the game too, might I add. But still, it is a small change that I like about the remake, and while just a small detail, I do appreciate that the Koholint sword can actually be used to break clay pots in the remake, making it so much easier to breeze through rooms like this, even further removing the tedium of inventory management that was necessary in the original. But I'm getting off track. There's a small moment where we can pop outside of the dungeon for a heart piece, warp point, and another entry point into the dungeon itself, perhaps as a little callback to the Turtle Rock of A Link to the Past. And I just always find that sort of thing to be charming. It makes the place feel more believably integrated into the world itself, like it actually takes up space here in the world, even if that spacing isn't exactly to scale. As for the magic rod, it is such a cool dungeon item, and I appreciate its utility in this dungeon especially. It's used well for an item gate as well as a puzzle solution, and is critical for defeating the dungeon boss. That's all good. It's just too bad that such a cool item comes so late in the game, because outside of the dungeon, it ends up not really having any utility at all. That sort of thing is bound to happen with late game items, but it's still too bad. It would have been nice for it to be used for at least a secret or two out in the overworld. Oh well, at least we can still set likes on fire. All of that said, Turtle Rock is still very fun and satisfying to pick apart. I love dungeons that let you just go off and explore, and they make it worthwhile to do so, while still not compromising on individual puzzles or combat. Overall, I really feel it's a standout dungeon, and I even think I prefer it to A Link to the Past's version of Turtle Rock, which is likewise a dungeon I had a lot of praise for. It's visually distinct, has a great piece of music, and is so fun to comb through. It's the game's ultimate big tangled knot. But of course, there's one more thing to address before we end this video. We've done it. We've collected all 8 instruments of the siren, which means it's time to awaken the windfish. We can play the Ballad of the Windfish in front of the egg atop Mount Tamaranch, which cracks open to reveal an entrance. While I don't really count this as a dungeon, I do still want to briefly talk about the egg, the final boss, and ending of the game. So, let's get into it. The inside of the windfish's egg is a pretty simple maze puzzle, the solution to which can be found in the library, in a book titled Dark Secrets and Mysteries of Koholint Island, which you'll need to have at least progressed the trading sequence enough to have gotten the magnifying lens in order to read. The book will give you directions through the maze, and unlike the color dungeon entrance, the order is semi-randomized from playthrough to playthrough. There's apparently only a select pool of sequences you can get, but you don't know which one it's going to be, so it's best to just check the book to be safe. Within this egg, there is a drop down this pit, followed by a series of seemingly infinite rooms. But if you follow those directions, you'll make it through quickly enough. Aesthetically, the egg interior is interesting. The original does what it can on the Game Boy, keeping a consistent cool tone, with a unique hourglass-like floor pattern and walls that would otherwise be unique if not for the color dungeon borrowing them. It looks good, but nothing extraordinary. The remake, meanwhile, reinterprets the whole place, giving it a damp, organic feeling. I have a hard time describing it any other way, but it feels so strange and otherworldly, like we could really be inside the windfish's brain here or something, navigating through his subconscious. It's somehow both tranquil and creepy at the same time, which works pretty well. The music in here is a tense, sinister take on the Ballad of the Windfish, which is a fitting piece for this section of anticipation. That dread comes through even stronger in the remake's version, with all of the added layers of instrumentation. But either way, it's a great track. Eventually, we'll find our way to a second drop, one that funnels us directly to the game's final boss, the Nightmare. Emerging from below Link, almost as if trying to draw from his own fears, these shadows will take shape, initiating the boss fight. And my goodness, what a final boss fight this is. It's so good, in fact, it makes up for how easy every other boss fight in this game is. With a 6-phase battle, let's run through it. First, it'll take the form of a giant Zol. The main challenge here is simply figuring out how to even inflict damage to begin with, as he's impervious to your attacks. The only thing that will work is magic powder, the first form taken out fittingly by our first item, the sword and shield aside, of course. If you played through the color dungeon, then you could look at the giant buzzblob mid-boss as being foreshadowing towards this phase of the fight as well, since it was also vulnerable to magic powder, and there's a physical resemblance in its weakened state. Next, pulling from Link's past adventure, it'll take the shape of Aghanim from A Link to the Past. And as you'd expect, this plays out as a classic game of Dead Man's Volley. Just as was the case when we fought him in that game, he'll teleport around the room, blasting energy at you, which you need to deflect back at him with your sword. Maybe it's my immense nostalgia for A Link to the Past, but this is so freaking cool. After enough back and forth, they'll take the shape of Moldorm, and just like the real Moldorm, you must strike his tail to deal damage. Also like the real Moldorm, this is a pretty easy phase of the battle. If it were up to me, I would have swapped the order around so that this one appears before Aghanim, but that's just me. Next up, the Shadow Nightmare will take the form of none other than Ganon. Maybe the Nightmares thought this one was Link's greatest fear. As was the case during the Aghanim phase, he'll attack much in the same way as the real Ganon did back in A Link to the Past, spinning his trident, launching fire keys at you, and of course throwing the trident itself. Again, this is just so cool. I've often thought that familiar elements from Link's past adventures could have subconsciously bled into the dream world, allowing the Nightmares to give shape to their monsters based on Link's experiences. And this series of battles feels pretty much like confirmation of that to me personally. Thankfully, no silver arrows are needed this time around. Some carefully timed spin attacks, and this shadow version of Ganon will go down like the others. The next phase is apparently a Lanmola, despite appearing more like a mini Moldorm, and it's the shortest and easiest of the bunch, but maybe this is the Nightmare getting panicky and lashing out in desperation. It's wounded, it's scared, and getting sloppy as a result, but fended off, and we'll get into the sixth and final phase of the battle. And can I just say that these Shadow Nightmares aesthetically look just so good? There's something so eerie about their just black shapes in the original especially, but they do a more than fine job with it in the remake, giving them this ethereal, glowy feel. Finally, it'll take the form known as Death Eye. Yes, that's Death Eye, D-E-T-H capital I, not Deathel with an L. Death Eye looks awesome. It probably served as the real-world inspiration behind Vati's design. While I usually am not the biggest fan of giant eyeball bosses with giant eyeball weak points, the truth is that Link's Awakening has steered away from this concept almost entirely, aside from Slime Eye, of course. Considering that, and the fact that this is 1 out of 6 phases for this final boss fight, and honestly this one gets a pass from me. You'll need to carefully avoid his arms, I think they're arms at least, and shoot his eye with one of the long-range weapons in your arsenal. Despite this being the epitome of cliché Zelda bosses, I don't know, I can't help but find myself enjoying this one. All of those complaints I should have on paper buckle under the weight of the atmosphere, the aesthetics, and the sheer coolness of it all. I feel like a hypocrite saying it, but the truth is, I like this final boss a lot. Not just the Death Eye phase, the whole dang thing. But maybe I'm just happy to see this game have a boss fight that actually manages to deplete some of my hearts for once. Before perishing, the Nightmare will lament the impending destruction of its world and the foiling of its plans, before ultimately being vanquished. With the Nightmare defeated, we can ascend these stairs and find ourselves in an empty void of space, where the owl, who is part of the Windfish's subconscious, will greet us one last time, commending us before vanishing. Before us appears the Windfish, finally lucid. And playing the instruments of the siren, Link will choose to wake together with this deity in exchange for the total annihilation of Koholint Island. It is not destroyed, it simply ceases to be. But our experiences, the memories make it real. Even beyond that, it was real, wasn't it? If a god dreams a world, and you can really be there and experience it, is it real? Cut to a scene out at sea, not just the Windfish, but Link's Awakening. I find myself struggling to finish this script, struggling to find the words to describe this game, this finale. Despite being framed by such happy music, it's still incredibly bittersweet. It's frankly incredible what they were able to achieve here. How many Nintendo games really give you pause? How many of them get you to stop and think about your actions and if what you're doing is really the right thing to do? Even in games like Majora's Mask, a title littered with existential dread, you never question if you're secretly the bad guy. Of course, Link isn't in this game. The nightmares do end up showing their hand, and they're not as innocent in all this as one might be led to believe. And their downright parasitic actions and nefarious intentions do become clear, but they give you room to question it all for a bit first. They still suffer, they still plead with you. Even if they're in the wrong, they still tell you they don't want to die. They still fight for their existence. You feel a level of desperation coming from them, something no other Zelda game has done. How many games, heck, how many pieces of media take the trope of "it was all a dream" and actually make it work? Not many. And don't even get me started on Marin. How a character with so few lines can feel so tragic is frankly an achievement. I adore this game and all that it has to offer. It is impressive how Link's Awakening takes all of the ambition of what was being realized on its home console Big Brother and squeezed it into a little Game Boy cart. Yes, compromises had to be made to get it to just work, particularly the controls and inventory management, which I've criticized heavily, but what this game has to offer is somehow still nothing short of an excellent Zelda game. But on the topic of its dungeons, Link's Awakening truly excels on that front. Barring a couple of, shall we say, underwhelming ones, these dungeons are otherwise solid. And you can see that influence. The item gating, the variety of mechanics and styles of progression all carry over to future titles in a way that can't ever be understated. That said, we've now covered them all, so this is a wrap on the dungeon design of Link's Awakening. It has been an absolute pleasure. Next on the schedule, we'll be covering the Dungeons of Echoes of Wisdom, which has just released at the time I'm recording this. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Since you watched all the way through, here's a bonus tidbit for you. So, one of my patrons, Darren, recently sent me a video from the channel Press A, in which the creator claims that it is possible to soft lock yourself in the original Game Boy version of Link's Awakening. I'll put a link in the description to that video. However, as Darren pointed out to me, they never actually show footage of it in that video. They tell you you can soft lock yourself, but they never actually show you. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and decided to double check for myself. Now, the original version of the game is not on NSO, which is how I've been playing on the DX version, so recording footage is a bit tricky, but I still had two options. I have the Zelda Game & Watch, which has the original version of the game, and I also have an original Game Boy cartridge of the game. Since the Game & Watch is so small and I can only record off screen, I decided to dust off my Super Nintendo, plug my Link's Awakening cartridge into my Super Game Boy, and then plug the console into an HDMI converter, and then into my capture card, and voila! This is unfortunately the best I could get it to look, but there you have it. We have Game Boy footage, right from an original cartridge. And because I'm an especially sane person, yes, I did start a new save file and play all the way through to Angler's Tunnel just to check this one detail out, and the verdict is yes. Press A is correct. You can indeed make this jump with the Pegasus boots and Rock's Feather, and potentially spend keys out of order to softlock your dungeon progress. Now, I went and made the jump before grabbing the necessary key because I didn't actually want to softlock myself, but I can indeed confirm that the jump is possible. Now, this is not possible in later versions of the game because the floor tile you would need to jump off from was removed, with deep water taking its place. So you simply don't have that jumping off point anymore. So this does not work in the DX or Switch versions of Link's Awakening, only in the original monochrome Game Boy version. Anyways, that's your bonus tidbit for the day. Thank you, Darren, for inquiring, and thank you all for watching. Bye-bye for real this time.